The young lady was riding in a carriage, and the people outside the window were rejoicing. She sighed heavily, as she understood perfectly well that she was now on her own. She knew that people called her an unlucky bride. And the reason for this was her husband nicknamed the god of death Hades. He was the son of the empire, who bathed in eternal glory. The reason this marriage took place with Emperor Rofer's Catar Esperion is because she overdid it with alcohol. The young lady was furious, and drinking alcohol was indignant. It was not her fault that the man was such an ignoramus. She got drunk for the simple reason that her fiancé, whom she had not seen for 10 years, had dumped her because she was a know-it-all. She simply pointed out the obvious fact to him, but he broke off the engagement. She looked at the young man and said that even the emperor would not do such a thing. The young man thought for a moment, and looking at her said that she was absolutely right. The young lady froze, looking at the young man. She wondered who he was. She was puzzled and did not know how long he had been with her. When she looked up from her mug, the man was sitting in front of her. She could see that he didn't look like a bad boy. She ate the food he offered her with a smile. After that, she knew that he had already surpassed her stupid ex-fiancé. She sighed heavily because she wanted to go back to the academy. She did not want to look for a groom anymore, and she did not need marriage. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was looking for a partner. She screamed that she hated old and ugly people. She said that if she had to get married, she would like an intelligent and handsome young man. She looked at the young man with confusion, as she could not see his face because of the hood, but she thought he was very handsome. She noticed that he had a very good voice. She liked his wonderful amber eyes. He looked at her in surprise and said that she shouldn't sleep here. She sighed heavily and said that she was very tired. The young man looked at her intently and asked if she was okay. The lady realized that he suited her in all respects. She noticed that he was very kind, and also very handsome, and knew how to listen. She grabbed his hand and asked if he was married. He looked at her in surprise. She asked with a smile if he loved someone or if he was engaged. The young man sighed heavily and said that he did not have a lover. She looked at him with a smile and said that it was very good and he suited her. She smiled and said that they could get married. The young man froze in shock as he did not expect such a thing. She said with a smile that she was asking for his hand. The young man looked at her in surprise for a moment, then thought about the offer. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really didn't want to. Oleg said that wasn't the issue. He looked at her intently and asked if she cared about the man's status. She asked in surprise what he was talking about. She instantly thought about it because she knew that only aristocrats came to the bar in secret to freely enjoy drinking. She looked around and realized that there was no sign anywhere that the bar was for nobles. Only. She looked at him closely and asked if he was a commoner. For a moment, the young man froze in place. She thought she had touched him on the quick. She smiled and said that she had a title, and he could become part of her family. She said she needed to get married and have an heir, and her ex-fiancé was not only stupid, but also old and bald. She looked at him intently and said that children take on the traits of their parents, and with such a father, there will be no offspring. She said that her parents might not like him at first, but his face would make them change their minds. She looked at the young man intently as she realized that her words had no effect on him. She sighed heavily as she understood that she would have to meet with aristocrats. She wanted to drink herself to death. The young man looked at her in surprise and told her that she needed to stop. She said with a smile that she felt great and that it was time for her to go home as she needed to meet potential men. She smiled and said that she wanted to sleep already. He said in surprise that she should stop as she might run into danger. She looked at him intently and told him that he should be quieter. The lady pulled him towards her, and in doing so, pulled the hood off his face. She said the hood made him look suspicious. She looked at him intently and wondered why he hid such beauty. She frowned, not understanding what he was saying. The young lady was getting sleepy. A moment later, she fell asleep with a smile of oblivion. The maid, drawing aside the curtains, asked her mistress if she was awake and how much she had drunk yesterday. The young lady sighed heavily as she had a headache. She wondered how much she had drunk yesterday. She thought for a moment as she felt as if she had forgotten something important. The young lady was in shock. Her head hurt very badly, as if someone had hit it with a hammer. She sighed heavily and said about the maid that she had not touched alcohol for a long time, and that was the reason she felt so bad. She looked at the maid in surprise and asked how she got home at all. The maid looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't remember. She said that one of the workers had brought it. The maid said that they were very lucky that the man had thought to come to the back door. Otherwise, the countess would have seen her. The lady, in turn, now understood why the pub needed the names of the customers, since they took drunken guests home. But she was puzzled and didn't understand why they didn't give her the bill. She wondered if she had really gone too far, and they were counting the damage. A moment later, the young lady greeted her friend with a smile. Ellie greeted Lorraine with a smile. She was very happy to see her friend. Ellie smiled and thanked her friend for the invitation. Lorraine smiled and told her friend that she looked wonderful. The lady knew that she had the effects of drinking on her face and had to put on makeup. The lady wanted to find out from her friend what happened with her fiancé. Ellie said that they had not seen each other for 10 years, and they simply were not right for each other. She sighed heavily and said that it was the Count who decided to break up. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise as she saw that she was looking at her very strangely. Lorraine looked guiltily at her friend and asked if she knew that the Count was very worried about his weak mind. Looking at her friend, she said that the Count's family is connected with trade, so everyone in the family speaks more than 3 languages, and he failed the language exam 3 times. The young lady told her friend what had really happened. Lorraine sighed heavily and said that her friend had only given him a hint. Ellie said that she always kept quiet when he talked nonsense. Her friend said that the Count seemed to want an intelligent and submissive wife. She looked at her friend with a smile and told her not to be angry, but the Count said all sorts of things about her. She looked at her friend and said that people are talking about it now, friend. They discussed the news of the Emperor's imminent marriage. The maid looked at the lady in surprise and said that she was very early. The lady sighed heavily and said that she did not know anyone at that party. She heard many things said about her, and if she had stayed a little longer, she would have made a scandal. She looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she had really brought her a fresh newspaper. The maid said that that was exactly it. She opened the newspaper because she wanted to know who would become the emperor's wife. He announced the marriage 7 years after the beginning of his reign. She was surprised because the newspaper portrayed the emperor as a terrible person. She felt very sorry for his bride. She read that the emperor was seen with a woman. There were no details about her face, but she had long pink hair. The young lady stood frozen in shock. She didn't understand what she had just read. She wondered if they had written about hers. She met the emperor. She was wearing a wig. She had pink hair with blue tips. The young lady threw the newspaper down in denial. She was puzzled by the situation. She sighed heavily and laughed, wondering if her eyes had deceived her. She laughed hysterically and said that all sorts of strange words were coming to mind. She knew that after the breakup, she was very irritated and put on a wig without looking. She was sure that her hair color was completely different. She knew her maid would not use such a bright color. The young lady froze in shock as she realized that the newspaper was writing about her when she opened the chest that contained the wig. She knew that she had been drinking with someone and that her maid had gone to the bar, but found out there that the bill had been paid. She had not been to the capital for a long time, so she did not know anyone. The young lady was shocked. She wondered if she had met the emperor then. She couldn't believe it because it was hard to imagine him there. She thought for a moment and remembered that her maid had kept newspaper clippings from the celebration of the founding of the empire. She was in shock because she didn't believe that something like this could happen. He looked at her hard and said she mustn't sleep. He asked if she could go. He said she had to wait for the carriage. The lady said with a smile that she did not care about his status since she was smart and rich. The young man said that he knew about it. The young lady in turn froze in place and wondered what she had done. She was alarmed as she did not know what kind of lady the emperor was going to take as his wife, since her identity was unknown. Everyone tried to find out more, but found out nothing since there were no free ladies with such hair color in the empire. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that she would be in big trouble. She knew that now everyone would be talking about the emperor's wedding. She knew that she must have forgotten something because of the alcohol. She thought that she would not have been able to speak so casually with the emperor. But in turn, she was guilty since she chatted casually with the emperor. And that evening, it was her fault that she allowed the emperor to serve her food. She was guilty of boasting about her position to the emperor. She remembered smiling and saying that he looked great without his hood. She smiled, looking at the emperor, and said that she had already imagined their future, and he did not need to worry. She said with a smile that even if they got married, there was no need to worry about the children's appearance. The young lady was shocked as she remembered that she had imposed herself on the emperor very strongly and proposed to him. She had an excellent memory, so she could force herself to remember every detail. She knew she would be executed for her drunken chatter. She was more worried about the embarrassing behavior than about a possible marriage with the emperor. She thought that it was not her fault, since she did not know who was in front of her, because he did not even introduce himself. She was surprised because the newspaper wrote about the emperor's wedding, but at the same time they were looking for a bride. She knew they still hadn't figured out who that lady really was. But the emperor had simply made a statement. She looked closely at the emperor in the newspaper and noticed that he was very handsome. She was sure that some men, like women, were afraid of marriage. She thought that she had worked herself up. She knew he wasn't crazy enough to marry a drunken stranger. She wanted to send a letter to the academy. She wanted to agree to take the offered position of professor. Sometime later, her mother entered the room and looked at her daughter in surprise, as she did not understand why she was making so much noise. The young lady, in turn, slowly tore up the newspaper and asked her mother for forgiveness. She asked her mother in surprise what had brought her to. Her madame smiled and said that she had received wonderful news and had come to her. Madame handed her the invitation with a smile and said that the emperor had invited all unmarried ladies to the ball. Ellie was surprised, as this was the first time the emperor had arranged something like this in the palace. She was puzzled and did not understand why he was throwing a ball and wondered why all the unmarried girls needed to be there. The lady looked at her daughter and said that she was very worried about the break in her engagement, but she noticed that it would be a good opportunity for her daughter. The lady told her daughter with a smile that they needed to visit the studio tomorrow and choose the best outfit for her. The young lady, in turn, had nothing against marriage, but she did not want to connect her life with a fool. She looked at her mother intently and said with a smile that she agreed. The man looked at the emperor in surprise and asked what he had done to deserve this. The emperor, in turn, looked at him intently and asked why he was asking. The emperor asked in surprise, "Does he really want to know why he must die?" The emperor said that he was also interested in something. He said he wanted to know more about the documents he kept in his safe. The emperor looked at the man with a grin and asked why he needed a special reason to crush a bug like him. The emperor smirked and told the man that he was a fool for forcing the emperor to kneel before him, and because of that, he already deserved to die. The emperor told his assistant to take away all the man's property and bring him the safe. He also said that they should execute everyone who was related to him by blood. The aide told the emperor that the aristocrats would be agitated. The emperor said that he had more power than anyone. The emperor looked sideways at his assistant and said that they must execute anyone who shares a drop of blood with a criminal. He said that they cannot allow them to use their bloodline as a reason to rebel in the future. The servant looked at the emperor and greeted him. Looking at the emperor, he said that his suit was almost ready. The servant told the emperor that they had heard that the future empress's hair had an interesting color, so their masters were having difficulty choosing a color. The emperor said with a smile that they should not pay too much attention to the newspaper gossip, since the lady had blonde hair. The young lady, in turn, screamed after she saw the extravagant dress. She was in shock and could no longer see anything as she was blind. The maid told the young lady that she could not refuse every outfit. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood, but they were all too sparkly. The maid said that in their day, everyone wore that. The maid looked at the lady and said that the countess insisted on the outfits, and she must make her choice. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she had an idea. The young lady, in turn, wanted to choose an outfit without ribbons and frills. She understood that she couldn't eliminate all the outfits and wanted to choose at least one outfit. She said with a smile that she had chosen this outfit. The maid, puzzled, said that it was morning. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood her mother, but she did not want to go to the ball. The maid looked at the lady intently and said that she would give her a rest and find the dress herself. She looked at the lady with a smile and said that she should rest a little while. She looked around. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily. She knew that she needed to complain less. She wanted to look around a little when suddenly she heard the conversation of young ladies. They were surprised that the emperor decided to gather all the unmarried ladies, but they knew that unmarried men would be there too. They said that the emperor hated the balls because of the noise. The young lady noticed that everyone was talking about nothing but the celebration. They also discussed the upcoming wedding, but no one knew about the bride. She saw that no one looked happy, even though the ball was taking place in the emperor's palace. She overheard their conversation and wondered if the emperor had killed someone right at the celebration. They discussed how he even got rid of the nanny who had taken care of him since he was young. The ladies said that one should be careful with the emperor. The young lady froze in shock. She did not understand what they were talking about. She knew that her subjects should respect and serve the emperor, but she was surprised that he executed without trial. The maid looked at her mistress with puzzlement and said that she was afraid that the lady had run away, but she was just hiding. Yu smiled as she looked at the maid and asked if she had found the outfit. The maid said that she had spoken to the seamstress and she had offered to make a custom dress. The young lady smiled and said that they should get this over with quickly and go get something to eat. The ladies discussed the emperor's bride, but they did not envy her at all. They knew that the emperor had previously said that he would not marry. They did not understand how long the empress would be able to live with him. The young lady knew that people went crazy when they could find out more about something that interested them. She knew that she had to find out everything about the emperor, and the emperor was the third prince and the child of the second wife of the former emperor, so he was not of particular value. At the age of 15, the prince became a knight and then received the rank of captain on his own. He even crushed the demons in the Kural Mountains, which were previously thought to be impossible to defeat afterwards. He completed the map of the Western Mountains and returned to the capital. The young lady knew that with such achievements, it would be easy for him to become an ideal candidate for the title of emperor. But before his coronation, many strange things happened. A year after the current emperor returned, the crown prince fell from his horse and died, and the second prince died in his carriage. Having lost 2 sons, the empress went to the south, where she died of illness. She knew that the death of her relatives was to the advantage of the current emperor, and probably such stories were the reason why the nobility remained silent. She wondered if he was a tyrant who took lives easily. She knew that public executions were very strange, but he would not have treated a drunken woman so politely if he had been a tyrant. Elier sighed heavily, wondering why she needed all this. She was furious because she knew that if she hadn't gotten drunk because of her fiancé, she wouldn't have gotten involved with the emperor. She thought for a moment that it would be quite an honor to drink with the emperor. She knew that she had to keep a low profile at the celebration. She understood that even if she was wearing a wig, the emperor would still guess since he was quite observant. She thought that he was probably deliberately maintaining the image of a tyrant. She knew that if he executed critics, there would be no problem with nicknames and accusations. The emperor thought for a moment, for if he had known that he could bind her to himself with the ring, he would have taken advantage of it long ago. The maid looked at her mistress and asked if she should choose her own hairstyle. Elier said that she could do as she wished. The maid told the mistress with a smile that she was very happy when she herself took the initiative in the studio. She looked at the seamstress and said she wanted to see less ribbon and trim on the dress, and she didn't want to throw the dress away. The young lady in turn sighed heavily as she knew that the department was in a bad way, as she thought that she looked better than usual. The maid looked at her mistress with a smile and said that she had never joked like that before. The young lady looked at her friend closely and said that she looked just fine and that she should dress up more often like that. Elier thanked her friend for the compliment, puzzled she had asked for as few frills as possible because she thought that she would not stand out. The young ladies looked at the whole crowd in surprise. They were surprised because there were many free people in the empire. Lorraine said the invitation said all single ladies were to attend, but she had just gotten engaged, so she was on the list too. She looked around carefully and said that if you take into account all the engaged people, it would be easy to explain the number of guests. The young lady looked at her friend and said that she needed to talk to the others. Ellie said with a smile that she could go. She smiled, and looking at her friend, said that she really hoped she would meet someone today. The young lady in turn understood that she had to remain inconspicuous all evening. She was puzzled because she knew that she could not leave before the emperor appeared. She noticed that people were arguing all the time, whether he was a tyrant. She had already found the nearest exit and now all she had to do was wait for the emperor. She looked at the glass of fine alcohol for a moment, wondering where the emperor had gotten it. A moment later, the arrival of the emperor was announced. She looked closely at the man who had been watching her drunken antics from behind, and she realized that he was the emperor after all. She noticed that in the pictures in the newspapers, he seemed less unapproachable. She didn't remember at all why she suddenly decided to marry him while drunk. She didn't understand why a man like the emperor would throw a ball. She didn't understand what he was thinking at all. She hoped that he would explain everything. Soon Elier was shocked, as he did not say a single word. She noticed that no one cared. She knew that a lot of money had gone into the celebration. She wondered if she was the only one who cared about the empire's treasury. She knew that such holidays were not for her, and fortunately, she did not stand out. She noticed various expensive decorations on all the guests, but in turn, she saw that the emperor was not interested at all. The young lady knew she had to try to slip away. She didn't know what he was thinking, and she didn't want to know. She wanted to finish something. She saw a glass of delicious alcohol. She was interested in learning about this drink. She wanted to know if it was expensive. The young lady thought for a moment, as she really wanted to know the name of the drink. The emperor looked closely at the young lady. He was glad that she was enjoying the celebration. He knew she couldn't drink much, and the emperor wondered if he should intervene. A moment later, she placed the empty glass on the table. She wanted to drink some more, but she knew she shouldn't. The young lady knew it was time for her to go home, but suddenly she froze in place as she heard someone talking. She was shocked because she realized that the voice was familiar to her, because it belonged to the man she got drunk on and who left her. He told the guests with a smile that he had recently purchased this necklace. Everyone praised him for his excellent taste. She looked at the man closely, as he was as ugly as before. She saw a young lady next to him and wondered if this was the new bride. Elier was shocked as the young lady had just come of age. She did not understand why he was bragging about the necklace if she saw that it was of poor quality. She was surprised and did not understand why everyone was currying favor with him. She didn't want to look at him or listen to him the way he irritated her. She looked into the distance as she saw her escape route. She was puzzled because she needed to pass by him. She wanted to leave quickly before he noticed her. The man looked into the distance as he saw a familiar silhouette. He looked at the lady intently as she was very self-confident and insulted him. He was furious because he knew she was arrogant because she had an education. He looked after her with a grin and said that he had seen a brilliant lady. He asked where she was going since the ball had only just begun. He said with a grin that she seemed to be trying to escape. He asked if he was wrong. The lady, looking at the count with a smile, greeted him and also asked why she should run away from the palace if it was the safest place in the capital. She was called a genius from a young age. It just so happened that the structure of mana interested her more than toys. The lady asked her daughter in surprise if she was sure she wanted a book for her birthday. She said with a smile that this was what she had dreamed of. She was an only child, so her parents fulfilled all her wishes. She was a 10-year-old girl who scored the highest marks when entering the academy. Not every scientist could repeat her success. The lady told her mother that she did not want an engagement, as she was going to the academy, and she did not like the Count at all. Madame said that she understood her, and she did not like him either. The young lady said that in that case she might not marry him. Madame said that the Count's family was very rich, and they could support her aspirations in the future. Madame looked closely at her daughter, and sighing heavily said that the world is often harsh to women. The Count looked at the lady with disdain and asked if she was hiding in a corner since no one was accompanying her. He said with a grin that it was hard for him to see her in this position since she was his ex-fiancée. She said with a smile that he shouldn't worry about her at all. She asked for forgiveness as she was about to leave. The Count in turn was furious. Grinding his teeth, he squeezed his bride until it hurt, and she made a drawn-out sound of pain. The Count, with a grin, told the lady to look at the jewelry his bride was wearing. He said that she probably felt sorry for it because it didn't belong to her. She looked at him in surprise as she thought he wanted to make a scene. Elier sighed heavily and said that she did not understand him. He looked at her intently and said that if she hadn't acted like a know-it-all, he would have showered her with all the riches in the world. She was shocked and wondered if he was ashamed to disgrace his fiancée. She walked away slowly and told him that he could now please his bride, and also wished him a good evening. The count said that he sympathized very much with her parents, as they had great hopes for their only daughter. He said that she, however, gave up her happiness. He said that she did not understand why her parents sent her to the academy. The young lady remembered that her mother had said that she could find a better groom because there were many good men in the world. She was tired of looking for a partner, but she had nothing against marriage. She understood that he was simply not capable of becoming better. She was puzzled because she had tolerated him all the time. She had tolerated his antics. The lady smiled and told her daughter that she was very proud of her because she might not realize it now, but the marriage would benefit her. She said that the more power her husband has, the more freedom she has. She looked at the count with a grin and said that she was more worried about his parents, who were putting up with such an inept son. She did not understand why they did not hire a teacher for him. The count looked at her with fury and asked what she said. She smiled and said that there was no shame in being a slow learner. Elier said with a smile that the real fool is the one who does not see his own shortcomings. The count's companion froze in place, and everyone began to whisper. Elier looked at the count with a smirk and said that it might take time, but she hoped that he would find a teacher of his level. He looked at her with fury and asked what she was. He said he did not understand how she dared to read him notes. She smiled and said that notes refer to music. She said with a smile that he probably wanted to lecture her. She didn't mean to say that he was illiterate, but he confirmed it himself. He looked at her with fury and could not utter a word. He came closer to her and asked her angrily how she dared to say such a thing to him. He asked if she really thought she was smart and was laughing at him now. She looked at the count intently, for she saw that he was simply a pitiful man and that he could not frighten her. The count shouted furiously that no man would want such a slut as she, and he raised his hand to hit her. The young lady was in shock. She wondered if he was going to hit her. At the same time, she instinctively closed her eyes, expecting the blow. A moment later, she opened her eyes, not understanding who had stopped him. She looked in surprise at the emperor, who shielded her with his body. The emperor angrily asked the count how he dared to raise his hand against a lady in his presence. The emperor asked the count if he had forgotten who the owner of the ball was. The count froze and asked the emperor in surprise what he meant. The young lady, in turn, was shocked. She did not expect that the emperor himself would stand up for her. She stared at him, unable to look away, and the emperor told the count with contempt that it seemed that the rumors about his hopeless stupidity were not lying. The emperor kicked the count and asked with contempt who had allowed him to create disorder at the celebration. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what was happening. She knew that the count had tried to hit her, but he had been prevented. The emperor looked intently at the young lady and asked if she was listening to him. Elier looked at him in bewilderment. The emperor asked if he should deal with the count. She looked at the emperor in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The emperor looked sideways at the count and said that he was talking about that fool. He said that he would deal with it as usual. He looked at the lady intently and said that it would take him 15 seconds, but that blood would have to be spilled. The lady said that this should not be done since today was a holiday. For a moment, the emperor thought about what she said. A moment later, he refused, saying that he needed to get rid of anyone who might cause trouble in the future. The emperor said, young lady, that he was waiting for her to come, but the count ruined everything. He said that they had much to discuss. The young lady looked at the emperor in bewilderment, as she did not understand what to talk about. He looked at her with a smirk and said that after everything that happened, she couldn't forget what she did that night. He looked intently at the young lady and said with a smile that she had asked for his hand. He said that he had received an official proposal, and some formalities needed to be observed, and since she had made the first move, he could not approach her first. The emperor looked intently at the young lady and said that he agreed to marry her. The emperor looked at her with a smile and said that he had offered her to drink tea instead of chewing the plate. She shuddered and in the blink of an eye came to her senses. Now she realized that the bride he was talking about was she. Elier knew that everything was very bad, since her head could not work normally. He smiled and said that she was quieter today than last night. She was taken aback and asked him to give her time to think. The emperor looked closely at the young lady and asked if they were really going to discuss her proposal right there in the hall. He looked at her and said that he didn't mind at all, but he didn't think she would be happy with it. He looked at her intently and asked if she was listening to him. The young lady flinched as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, she said that he was right, and that this was not the best place as she had seen the stares on her. She wondered if she would be punished for insulting the imperial family. The emperor looked at her and said that she should follow him. The young lady in turn trembled with fear, because she knew that he could kill her at any moment. As she passed, she heard everyone whispering about her, because they wanted to know if she was the emperor's true bride. She sighed heavily, for she knew that she was now the woman who had ruined the emperor's ball, and she had also pestered him when she was drunk. She wondered if he really had the right to kill her. She had heard that he had killed people ignoring the law. She realized that he had accepted the offer only when she got rid of her useless thoughts. The emperor asked the lady if she had finished thinking. She looked at the emperor intently and trembling said that she had committed a terrible crime. The emperor looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that he was not interested in her misdeeds. He did not want to discuss them. Elier. She said that that night he hid his face when he went to the pub where a drunk woman made him an offer. She said that even though she was drunk, she remembers everything well. She knew that at that moment his eyes were shining very brightly. She was surprised that he accepted her proposal. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was glad that they had made some progress. She said that she didn't understand him at all. The young lady looked at the emperor with a puzzled expression and said that neither of them would gain anything from this marriage. For a moment he thought, and said that she herself proposed to him, but did not accept her consent. She said that they refused him, but a more noble person would be better suited for the role of Empress. She was sure that she had made him a sincere proposal, since his face had attracted her very much at that time. She thought she was walking towards her ideal, but it turned out to be the emperor himself, and if she married him, she would become part of the imperial family. She looked at him with a smile and told him that he could take it as a drunken mistake and just let it go. He asked her if she was sure she remembered everything that happened that night. She said it was a little confusing for her, but she remembered all the details. A moment later, the young lady froze in place, wondering if she really remembered everything. The emperor looked at her intently and said that he had something he wanted to tell her. He said he never sought information about her or her family. He sighed heavily and said that she had taken off his hood and embarrassed him in public, and it was difficult for him to resolve the situation. He said that a month was enough to prepare, since the bride had a lot on her mind. As he left, he said that they would agree on the wedding date later. The young lady stood frozen in shock as she hoped that he would let her go, and she would be free. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she had met someone during the holidays. Elier asked the maid who she would choose as a pet, a nasty leech or a wild lion. Jerry said that she would not choose anyone. Sometime later, the young lady finished all her preparations and went to look for her mother. Madame looked closely at her daughter and asked with a smile how her ball had gone. Elier sighed and said that she could only confirm that the count was trash and not a human being. Madame said with a smile that she would probably have a dozen letters waiting for her tomorrow. She asked her mother what she was doing at such a late hour. Madame said, with a smile, that she wanted to look at her daughter when she was little. Madame said she was very sorry that there were only her childhood portraits here, and they needed to paint another one before her wedding. Elier sadly asked her mother if she was still convinced that a woman should get married. The lady sighed heavily and told her daughter that everything was exactly like that. Looking at her daughter, she said that now only a few women hold high positions, and perhaps one of them will change the world. She asked her mother how much she could achieve if she became empress. Madame asked in surprise if the emperor had announced who he would marry today. Lady said that this was not so. Lying down, Emperor thought about the beautiful young lady. He knew that she had always been the sun for him, and no one else could change that. Unfortunately, he could no longer return to those times. She looked at him intently and said that they would definitely get married, and there was no turning back. The young man in turn sighed heavily. She asked in surprise why he was sighing so heavily. She asked puzzled if he really didn't like the idea of marrying her. He looked at her intently and said that it was not that the young lady was very irritated and did not understand what the problem was. She didn't understand why he hesitated. She said that if he found her, she promised not to pretend to be a stranger. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that this situation was simply terrible. She did not know what to do. Sometime later, the maid informed the lady that people from the imperial palace had arrived. Sometime later, the man read to the young lady a letter written by the emperor himself. He said that if she wanted to say something, he would certainly inform the emperor about everything. She saw that he had indicated the cost limits, asking how much on average it cost for an imperial wedding. The man asked in surprise what limits they were talking about, since they had only brought her wedding gifts. She was shocked and said that she only needed a dress. She said that you can't spend too much on the ceremony. The lady said with a smile that her daughter seemed to be very excited about the upcoming wedding. The man looked at them in surprise, as he did not know if they were normal. The lady looked at the man and said that her daughter was very embarrassed. She asked for forgiveness for their rude reception. Madame said that her daughter would definitely tell her everything, and then she could help her with the preparations. Lady saw that her mother was furious. The man said that since she was to become empress, she must have knights to accompany her. The lady said that they should come tomorrow. She was worried that her mother would interrogate her, and she would not be able to say directly in front of the knights that she had drunkenly proposed to the emperor. She smiled and told the man to tell the emperor that she was pleased with the gifts. Madame looked at her daughter and said that her father would soon return, and he would definitely faint when he found out about everything. She asked her daughter why she didn't tell her everything right away. Elir Robko said that the engagement proposal came unexpectedly. Elir P. looked at her mother and said that her groom the emperor. She asked her mother if she was not happy with her choice. The lady sighed heavily and said that she was very glad that her daughter was getting married. She looked at her mother closely and said that she did not look happy. Madame said that they cannot go against the emperor's order, and their story is very beautiful. She looked closely at her daughter and said that if any of what was written was a lie, then she would have a very hard time in life. She understood perfectly well that their story was not like a fairy tale from books, and he took advantage of her drunken offer. She looked at her mother closely and said that she understood perfectly well that she was worried. She told her mother that she had already decided to agree to this wedding. The lady sighed heavily, and looking at her daughter, said that she understood her. Elia said with a smile that in that case she would go to her room. Looking at her daughter, Madame said that she had no time to rest. The lady looked at her mother in surprise and asked if they really had to start preparing for the wedding already. Madame said that if anyone finds out about the bride, they will try to find out about their family. They have nothing to do with politics, so everyone will be interested in the emperor's bride. The young lady sighed heavily. The lady smiled and told her daughter that she was very smart and asked if she could give up books for a month. The young lady was surprised. She said that you don't require weddings research and reports. Lady noticed that her mother was still angry. The emperor told his assistant that his bride was an unusual person, so they should multiply the numbers by 3 before giving her the information. The man said that after the incident at the ball, the count's family broke off the engagement, and their second son would take the place of the heir. The man sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, the count had escaped last night, and they were now looking for him. The count in turn was very angry with his brother because he told him to run away. He knew that all his troubles were because of the lady. He was furious and wanted to kill them all. He found out that he had to start with the girl first. He wanted to give her a humiliating and painful death. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he should kill the count. Then the lady might get scared and refuse him. The count was furious as he left. He insulted the lady. He knew that he simply would not accept all this. The emperor sighed heavily and said that the young lady would be very disappointed in him if she found out. The emperor sighed heavily and said that a man who does not strive to improve when given many chances has no right to remain alive. The emperor looked closely at the young lady and asked how the wedding preparations were going. He was worried and wanted to know if she needed anything. She looked closely at the man who sat in front of her with a beautiful face. She said timidly that he had already given her a lot, and she did not think that more would be needed. She was puzzled because, frankly speaking, she was not enjoying the situation too much. She did not understand why he invited her into the garden and wondered if he really wanted to maintain the image of their romance. The emperor looked closely at the young lady and said that she did not seem to like the tea. She looked at the tea in surprise and said that it was wonderful. The emperor looked at her in surprise as he noticed that she had not touched the cup since his appearance. He said they could reschedule the meeting if she was unwell. Elier, with a smile, said that she was fine, but in turn she was puzzled, as she had to work very hard. She could not say that her wrist hurt, and from preparing the invitations the night before. Madame looked at the young lady and said with a smile that His Majesty had invited her to the palace, and that it was very kind of him. She looked closely at the young lady and told her not to make any mistakes when they met. Elier was puzzled and did not understand why she was worried at all. She knew that she needed to throw all thoughts away. Elier looked at the emperor with a smile and said that it would be very awkward if she did not fit into the wedding dress. The emperor looked at the young lady closely and said that he didn't think she needed to worry about her figure. She was worried that she was taking up too much of his time. The emperor said that he would give up the wedding. They should get to know each other better. She was surprised because she felt that the rumors about the emperor were not entirely true. She looked at him intently and said that she had one request for him. The young lady hesitated, not knowing how to voice her request. She glanced sideways at the emperor's personal knight. The emperor looked at her in surprise and asked if Sir Balta was not up to the job. She was taken aback and said that it was not, that she said that she thought it was a bit excessive to give his personal knight to her since they were not yet married. She said that he stands out a lot, and she feels a little awkward being around him all the time. Some time ago, the knight knelt before the young lady and said that he would protect her with his life. As he had ordered His Majesty, the young lady in turn left in shock. As she did not expect such a thing, she asked him to rise. She looked at him intently and said that she would make him safe, and he could sit down. The knight said that he was perfectly fine, and he would stand. She in turn knew that nothing was fine. The knight looked closely at the young lady and said that he would try to be less noticeable, since he was causing her inconvenience. Elier in turn was well aware that his form was very conspicuous. She looked at the emperor and asked if a knight should be in uniform all the time. She said it would be better if he wore simple clothes. She asked if that was too rude a request. The emperor looked at her and said that at other times he would allow it, but not now. She was puzzled and did not understand what he was talking about. She did not know what his words meant. He looked at her intently, asked if she had heard anything about the family of Theseus. Elier sighed heavily and said that she had heard very little. She knew that after this situation, which happened at the second celebration, the son became the heir. She understood perfectly well that the leech could be annoying, but his family had been successfully trading for a long time, and since he brought so many problems, it was logical to replace him with another child. She said that some time had passed since their engagement had broken off, so she was not privy to the details. The emperor looked at her intently and said that the man had disappeared after he had ordered his detention. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted to capture the count. She did not expect to hear such a thing. The emperor sighed heavily and, after thinking, said that everything was exactly like that, although he had not made any public statements. He said that in honor of their wedding, he had lowered taxes and given money to poor areas. Everyone in the capital was celebrating, and he didn't want to spoil their mood. He said that foreigners also come to them for the celebration, but he has strengthened border security, and now they carefully check everyone who leaves the empire. She looked at the emperor intently and said that if he wanted to detain the count, then he had committed a crime. She was shocked and knew that this simply could not be, since the count was not smart enough for this. Looking at the young lady, the emperor said that the count had failed to pay a large tax on the profits of one of his businesses. The count had also imported a large number of prohibited items, and he had a knack for this kind of illegal business. The emperor thought for a moment and said that there was no evidence that he had left the capital, and that he was most likely hiding somewhere in the city. He looked at her intently and said that she would soon become Empress, and no one knows what the count is ready to do. The emperor looked at the young lady intently and said that her new knight was the most trusted knight in the empire, and that was why he had assigned him to her. She looked at the emperor intently and asked if he had specifically asked him to wear a uniform. Looking at the emperor, she asked what would happen to the count when he was captured. The emperor hesitated, not knowing what to answer her. He lowered his eyes and said that in a normal situation, he would be judged by the laws of the empire, but he has the audacity to hide. He said that perhaps he will punish him more severely. The young lady froze in place as she was very scared. She wanted to drop this question and not ask the emperor anymore. The knight approached the young lady and said that it was time for them to return. He said that he would take her there. The young lady looked at the knight with a smile and thanked him. Balta looked at her intently and said that he was simply following the emperor's orders. She looked at him intently and said that she was interested in something. She understood perfectly well that she could endure awkwardness next to the knight, then worry about the count. She looked at the knight intently and asked what kind of person he saw the emperor as. The knight was surprised, as he did not expect such a question. He thought for a moment, but a few minutes later, he said that the emperor was a good man. The young lady was surprised, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. She thought for a moment and asked if the emperor had a hobby. The knight quickly answered the question and said that the emperor didn't have anything like that. She looked closely at the knight, as this situation reminded her of her attempts to get along with one professor at the academy. Balta said that the emperor was very strong, and no one could defeat him in battle, and in the Coral Mountains he was inimitable. The young lady looked at the knight intently, as she knew she had to take her words back, as she could see that he simply adored the emperor. She looked at him intently and asked if he had gone to the Western Mountains with the emperor. The knight said that he had, and that he was younger, but was already superior to him, and he was very impressed by this. The knight said that without the emperor, their expedition would have failed. The young lady thought for a moment that the emperor must be very skilled for such a knight to praise him. She knew that if he were a selfish man, he would hardly go to such a dangerous place himself. She wondered if he was trying to strengthen his position among the nobility, since he needed marriage to get rid of the image of a tyrant. She knew that the tea party had been tense, but he did not ask rude questions and was very sensible. She thought for a moment, wondering which side of him was real. The man shouted that he refused the offer because he could not kidnap the daughter of an aristocrat. He knew that the empire's security had become more serious lately, and he could not do this. The man asked him angrily if he was afraid. He knew that he was a professional in such matters. The man shouted that he would double the price, and the money would last him for several months. The man looked closely at the money, because he knew that T was right. The man looked at the count intently. Could he promise him that he would not get into trouble if he did this? The count said with a smirk that he promised the man to do his best. He said that the girl's family was not so noble. The count looked at the man intently and said that he just needed to stop the carriage. The count looked at the man with a grin and said that he must not tell anyone about this. He said that he would finish him off before he could surrender to the guards. The count said that he would deal with her knight himself. He grinned as he squeezed the ring in his hand, and looking at the man, said that he had a special weapon. The knight looked at the young lady closely and said that he heard that she wanted to choose an outfit. He said that foreigners had recently arrived in the empire, so there were a lot of people on the streets, and now there were a lot of guards all over the territory, but it was better to remain cautious. He looked at her intently and said that they should return before dinner, but if she still had any other plans, then she should let him know about them. The young lady in turn hesitated. She looked at him closely and said that she knew he was supposed to be keeping her safe, but she didn't understand why he needed to know her schedule. He asked if he was just being a nuisance to her. She said that he wasn't, and that she was grateful to him, but she just felt a little awkward bothering him. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he needed to know everything about her plans for the day so that he could perform his duties better. The maid whispered quietly to the young lady as she wanted to know if knights were fired. If they smiled, Elier sighed in confusion and said that there was no such law in the empire. She remembered that the emperor had said that the knight would be annoying to her at their wedding. He had asked her to pretend that she did not see the knight, and he would not be noticed. She remembered the emperor's words, and it seemed to her that he really was driving out everyone who smiled. Balta looked intently at the young lady and said that he would ask the coachman to drive up to the door. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew perfectly well that she just needed to get used to his presence. She was sure that he himself did not like looking after a girl who was not yet an empress. She knew she had to hurry because everyone was talking about her now. She knew that, unfortunately, the count had not been caught yet. She felt very uncomfortable, but she knew she had to smile and endure. She was puzzled and wondered why the count had not been captured, if border security had been strengthened. The knight slowly approached the coachman. He looked intently at the coachman and called him, but the coachman in turn did not make a sound. The knight looked at the man in surprise and said that he was not the coachman. He wanted to know what happened to the real coachman. The man hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Without looking up, the man said that his companion had fallen ill and that he would be accompanying them today. The man told the knight that he could verify the truth of his words by asking his companion if he wanted. The knight looked at the man closely and asked if he knew who he would be leading. He said that they were not using the imperial carriage for the safety of the lady. He looked at the man intently and said that if he told anyone, the consequences would be unpleasant. The man sighed heavily, but did not answer. He was furious and trembling with fear because he understood that he had fallen into a trap. He was shocked and didn't know what to do because he had been lied to. The count had told him that the family had no power, but he had heard that the young lady would soon become empress. He was afraid that something might go wrong. The maid looked intently at the young lady and asked if she was not happy at the thought of the beauty of her future dress. Elier looked intently at her maid and said with a smile that she had already tried on his unfinished version. The knight helped the young lady into the carriage, and looking at her, said that he would definitely follow her. The young lady thanked him. She could not believe that she would be accompanied by the emperor's knight. She knew that no one would dare to approach her. The man froze in shock, as he knew this was making things very difficult, as he wanted nothing to do with the imperial knight. He was puzzled, as he had already taken the money. He knew he had to deal with the maid quickly and avoid her as much as possible. He knew that the rest did not concern him, and he just needed to escape. And the count in turn would decide everything himself further. The madam looked closely at the young lady, and with a radiant smile said that she was very beautiful. She looked at the lady and asked what she thought about the dress. She wondered if any adjustments needed to be made. The young lady said sheepishly that unfortunately, she did not know exactly what dresses were in fashion. Now she looked closely at those present and asked if the outfit was too chic. The madam looked at the lady and said that she had reduced the amount of decorations at the request of the young lady, but still it was an imperial wedding. The maid looked at her mistress and said that the madam was right, and the outfit could have been more luxurious. They looked closely at the young lady and said that the dress looked very much like a wedding dress. The young lady hesitated for a moment as she began to realize her situation. Now she understood that she was really getting married to the emperor of this state. Elier looked closely at her maid as she saw that she looked very happy, but she knew that when she got married, she would move to the palace, and unfortunately, she would not see her maid anymore. Elier looked timidly at Madame and called her. The young lady looked at her intently and quietly asked if it was possible to add something to the outfit, and of course, she would pay for everything. Madame looked at the lady in surprise and said that, of course, that was possible. The madame looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was very kind. Elier, in turn, thanked Madame for everything she had done. Madame looked at the lady with a smile and said that the size was perfect and she would add a few details so that the outfit would match the necklace given to her by the emperor. The madame looked at the lady and said that jewelry would make the outfit brighter. Balta S. stood on the street and kept order. He also heard the young lady's conversation. The lady looked at the lady with a smile and said that it was a great honor for her to help her with her wedding dress. She said that she would expect her on the morning of the wedding day. She told the lady to watch her figure, as it would be too late to adjust the dress to her. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that Madame had asked her not to gain excess weight, even if she did increase her shape. She looked at Madame with bewilderment and said that she understood her. She saw that people were looking at her with intent glances, but she understood that this was to be expected. She wanted to get home as soon as possible, but for a moment she froze and goosebumps ran through her body. Since in the distance she saw a familiar man, she froze in place because she realized that she saw the count. The young lady in turn screamed and called the count. The knight looked sideways at the young lady and said that she should wait for him there, and that he would return as soon as he had checked everything. The young lady in turn was alarmed and called her knight. A moment later, the knight looked around the corner to make sure he was right, and to eliminate the threat. But he did not notice anyone. He looked closely at all the buildings, because he noticed that, given the location of the buildings, It was impossible to hide quickly and not be noticed. He looked closely at the young lady and said that they should hurry for her safety. The young lady, in turn, agreed with the knight and asked if he had seen anyone. She was very alarmed and excited. The knight looked at the young lady and said that, unfortunately, he did not see anyone. And in this place, it is difficult to quickly hide if the person has not trained. She sighed heavily and said that perhaps she just imagined it. She asked his forgiveness. The knight looked at Elier intently and said that it was better to be careful if she felt danger. Elier froze and wondered if she was wrong. The coachman looked closely at the knight and said that he would certainly take them to the estate. She thought for a moment because she knew that the count did not have any martial arts. She thought that perhaps she was being followed by a person from some noble family. The count in turn was very angry. He knew that he would certainly take revenge on that girl. He knew that she would not become an empress. Jerry looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that her wedding dress was simply lovely and that she would look very elegant next to His Majesty. Elier looked at her maid in surprise and said with a smile that she looked more excited than she did. Jerry smiled and said that of course she was glad, since the young lady would not marry the count after all. She knew that she would have to listen to her complaints every day and also take care of a child who looked like an count. The young lady looked at the maid in confusion as their thoughts converged. A moment later, their carriage shook. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect such a thing. She screamed in surprise. The maid looked at the young lady with concern and asked if she was okay. She looked closely at the maid and said that she was okay, and also asked if Jerry was hurt. The young lady was agitated as she did not understand what was happening. She wondered if the carriage was okay. A moment later, she heard a noise that was in the street. A few minutes later, the knight opened the door and, looking at the young lady, asked if everything was okay with her. She looked at him in surprise and asked what happened. Balta sighed heavily and said that there seemed to be a problem with the wheel, and it looked like they would have to send out a distress signal. He looked closely at the young lady and said that it was very dark and dangerous outside. He asked her to stay inside the carriage with the maid. The young lady was a little puzzled as she knew that everything was fine with the carriage in the morning. She did not understand how this could happen. The knight frowned for a moment, and looking at the young lady, he said that he also thought it was suspicious. A moment later, he handed her the scroll as well as a small dagger. She looked at him in surprise. The knight sighed heavily and said that he hoped nothing bad would happen. He looked at the young lady intently and said that they had noticed a suspicious person during the day, and now a very casual situation had happened to them. He knew that they had to be vigilant. She looked at him intently but said nothing, as she knew perfectly well that he was right in this situation. Balta, in turn, understood perfectly well that the guards had to be nearby, and he had to give a signal immediately. He looked closely at the coachman and asked what was wrong with the wheel. The knight was very angry. Looking at the coachman, he said that he asked him to take the job very seriously. He told the coachman that he was carrying an important guest. The man in turn did not answer and continued to make the wheel. Baltazar lit a flare as he wanted to signal the other knights. He looked closely at the coachman and said that he had heard that there was often a spare wheel under the carriages. But at the same time, the count swung his weapon as he wanted to hit the knight. Balta in turn felt some pressure from behind and turned around, but unfortunately, the man was a little quicker and with a roar and fury struck the knight on the head. The maid looked at the young lady intently and, puzzled, said that something was wrong. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and excitement and asked what she was talking about. Jerry thought for a moment and wondered if the wheel was broken. Shouldn't they hear it being fixed? The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that her maid was absolutely right. She was puzzled because it was too quiet outside. She understood that given the character of her knight, he should have reported by now. She understood that something serious had happened. The young lady in turn became very wary, since she did not even hear the sounds of the battle. The young lady slowly handed the scroll and dagger to the maid. The maid looked at her mistress in confusion and asked why she needed to take it. Elier looked at the maid and said that, as she had said earlier, it was very quiet outside. She said that the knight would have spoken to them by now if everything was okay. She said that they needed to use his things to defend themselves. She looked closely at her maid and said that it was better to be safe than sorry. The maid looked at the dagger and asked what to do with it. A moment later, they heard a man's voice asking the lady to go out for a moment. She was excited and asked who was at the door. The man said he was the coachman, and the knight asked to bring her. The young ladies froze in shock. The maid said the coachman's voice had changed since the morning. The young lady was wary, as she knew something had happened to her knights. The maid shouted at the man not to lie, as the knight himself would have called them. The lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked what she was doing. Jerry looked closely at the lady and said that she needed to let her hair down to hide her weapons. Jerry told the lady they were in danger. She told the lady to keep her dagger and her flares. A moment later, they heard a crash, and later they saw a man. The count looked at the lady with fury and said she was always so difficult. He said she should have come out at once. The maid blocked the young mistress with her body. Elier looked at the man intently and froze in place as she recognized who he was. She screamed in surprise. The count looked at the maid with fury and told her to get out of the way. A moment later, the count angrily pulled the maid by the braid, and she involuntarily screamed. Elier was in shock as the count carelessly threw her maid to the ground. The count looked at the young lady with fury and said that she was irritating him and ordered her to stop screaming. The young lady in turn rushed to the maid, but the count managed to grab her by the hand and pulled her towards him with fury. He looked at her with fury and asked if she could imagine what a laughingstock he had become because of her. The young lady was shocked and wondered if the count was strong enough to defeat the knight. She wondered if her maid was okay. She looked at the count and said with disdain that he was wanted. She looked closely at her maid because she saw that the coachman had no score to settle with her. She understood that the count had simply bought him. She looked at the count with contempt and asked if that was the only reason he was trying to kidnap her. The count was furious. He shouted that he was the heir, and because of her, he had lost everything. Elier angrily looked at the count and asked what her fault was. She was shocked because she saw that he was like a beast. The young lady in turn could barely restrain her impulse. She wanted to scream because she felt that he would soon break her wrist. She knew that her other hand was free. She remembered that the maid had told her to keep the dagger to herself. She had told the young lady that she was the future Empress and must take care of herself. He shouted with fury and asked how she could boldly throw him out of the family. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she should soon become Empress, but Jerry's life was no less important. But still, the maid gave the young lady her weapon. The young lady understood perfectly well that when the knights arrived, first of all, they would help her. She knew she wouldn't just watch. Elier looked at the count and asked if it was her fault. He looked at her with fury and said that she had ruined his life. She looked at him with fury and asked why he always blamed her for his own worthlessness. At this, she pulled her hand away and struck him. The count was furious because he saw the young lady running away. He did not understand how she dared to hurt him. He shouted after her with fury that he would certainly kill her. The young lady ran away from the count in a hurry, but her heels and frills were in her way, and the count in turn ran after her furiously and shouted. She was puzzled and would never have thought that a dress could cause so much trouble during an escape. She did not know how much longer she had to run. She was breathing heavily and thought that she had spent all her energy on studying, but she needed to devote time to training. She saw that the count was running faster than she thought. She wondered if he had taken some kind of medicine. The count looked at her with fury and said with a grin that she could run away in any way that would only make him happier. The young lady stood frozen in place, not knowing what to do. She saw that there was a dead end ahead. She knew she couldn't give up, and she had to think of something fast. She looked at the count with fury and shouted that he was simply terrible. And at the same time, she launched a signal beacon. He looked at her intently and asked with a smirk if she was done with her little tricks. He didn't understand where she got so much self-confidence from. She looked at him with fury and asked if he had really lost his mind. She said that even if he killed her, the guards would catch him. He looked at the young lady with fury and said that he was prepared for death. When he came here with the speed of lightning, he grabbed her by the neck and began to strangle her. The young lady was shocked because she did not expect this. She was suffocating. He looked at her with fury and said that to make her suffer so that she could not expect an easy death. Elier looked at him intently and in a trembling voice, asked if he really thought that she was to blame for his troubles. He swung at her angrily and shouted at her to shut her mouth. He shouted that she might be the smartest, but right now she was just a weak girl. He struck her furiously, and she fell to the ground with a crash. She looked at him intently and said furiously that he seemed to know only one insult. L.E.R.P. looked at the Count and shouted that she should have guessed that he was a lost man after his words about the sun rising in the west. She shouted that he always shifted the blame onto others. She asked if he would really complain to his parents for giving birth to such a moron. A moment later, the Count slapped her angrily across the face and told her to shut her mouth. He could not tolerate her insulting him. She fell, and he kicked her. He was furious and did not understand why his life was over, and she would become Empress. He screamed furiously that he would not allow this. He looked at her with contempt and told her that she should keep quiet. The young lady, in turn, lay helplessly on the ground. She knew that men were physically superior to women, and that was a fact. She was in shock because she understood that the Count's strength was abnormal. She understood that it didn't matter anymore because she would still be beaten to death. But in turn, she hoped that her knight had not suffered too much at the hands of the Count. It felt sorry for its maid, as it just wanted to see her in her wedding dress. She wondered how soon the knights would save them. The young lady sighed heavily, as she did not know what to do in this situation. She understood perfectly well that if you died soon, the wedding would certainly be cancelled. Elier was afraid all the time because she did not know what the Emperor was thinking. She knew that there was no love between them, but she understood perfectly well that if she died, she would at least know that she was engaged to the Emperor and not to a pathetic leech. She knew that in the next life she would find an understanding and loving man. She wanted to spend her days researching and living life to the fullest. She heard the Count mocking her, but a moment later, the Emperor came up behind the Count. He struck the Count with fury. The young lady froze for a moment, as she was no longer in pain. She wondered if this was what death felt like. A moment later, she heard someone's terrible scream and opened her eyes. She slowly rose and sat down on the ground as she was puzzled. She did not believe that she was still alive. She looked at the Count in surprise, as she did not understand what was wrong with him. The Count froze on the ground in shock. He did not understand what was happening. A moment later, he screamed as he felt unbearable pain. The Emperor looked at the Count with contempt and said that everything happened because he did not get rid of the parasite. He sighed heavily and said that such people must be gotten rid of quickly. He was furious and did not understand how the Count dared to touch the Empress. The young lady in turn could not see the young man because she saw that he did not have the knight's uniform. She saw that he had neither armor nor weapons. She was surprised because he overcame the Count with ease. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked if that wasn't too much of him. A moment later, she screamed and asked the young man to stop. She looked at him intently and thanked him for saving her, and also said that if he continued, T.O. might just kill the Count. She said that he deserved to be beaten, but should be executed according to the law. A moment later, she froze in place in surprise as she saw the Emperor. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing here. Elier looked at the Emperor intently and said that she was expecting the knights to come. She said that her knight was attacked and asked the Emperor if he was alive. The Emperor walked up to the young lady. He was shocked as he saw her face and neck. He noticed that there were wounds on her body. He looked at her with rage and asked if that bastard had really inflicted wounds on her. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. She looked at the Emperor intently and said that she needed to buy time and had to take a risk. She looked at him intently because she did not understand why he was behaving this way. Elier understood that she had suffered by her own choice. She looked closely at the Emperor because she saw that he was in more pain than she was. She froze in place in surprise as she saw that his hand was shaking. The young lady timidly called out to the Emperor, and a moment later, they looked into the distance as they heard knights approaching them. The knights looked closely at the Emperor and said that they had captured the coachman in the forest and found Balta. They said that it looked like he had been attacked from behind. The Emperor looked at the knights intently and said that they would deal with it later. Balta! He said that they needed to bring the criminal to the palace since he dared to wound the Empress. The Emperor looked closely at the Count and said that he also had an unusual ring with him. He told the knights to take it off and examine it carefully. The young lady looked at the knights intently and said that they had captured the coachman, but there should have been a young maid with him. She asked excitedly if she was okay. The knight looked at the young lady and said that the maid was injured and she was blindfolded. He looked at the young lady and asked if she knew the maid. Elier looked at the knight and said that she was her maid, and also asked what her condition was. The emperor in turn looked intently at the young lady and reached out to her, but with the speed of lightning he stopped and looked intently at his hands as he had unconsciously reached out to her. Elier ran up to her maid in a hurry and asked if she was okay. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise. A moment later, the maid saw her mistress together with the emperor. The young lady looked closely at her maid and asked if she was okay, as she was very worried. Elier P. came closer to the maid and said that she would examine her now. She was very upset and worried, as she was worried that she was in pain somewhere. She saw that her hand was wounded. The maid looked at the young lady and told her to forget about her hand. She saw that the lady's face was wounded, with tears in her eyes. Jerry asked the young lady if the count had hit her. She screamed that he was just an arrogant animal. She cried and couldn't believe that he dared to hurt her. She said that it was her fault. Eller looked intently at the maid and said that she was fine, and she would apply the ointment and all the wounds would heal. She asked the maid not to cry. The emperor looked at the young lady intently as he was very upset. He knew that he was to blame for what had happened. Moments later, a knight called the emperor. The knight looked at the emperor intently and said that the count and the coachman he had hired had been captured. The emperor looked at his knight and told him to take them away and lock them in the palace. The knight said that he understood everything and also said that the carriage for the lady was ready. The emperor looked closely at the knight and told him to send as many knights as possible to her and bring her home. He also noticed that she had many wounds. He asked the knight to send a doctor from the palace to the young lady. The knight looked at Elier intently and said that it was already late and they would escort them to the manor. He said that they would be accompanied by knights so they could rest easy. Jerry looked at her mistress intently and said that she needed to quickly return to the mansion and treat her wounds. Elier Opashila, and looking at the knight, said that because of all the commotion, she forgot to ask what condition Sir Balta was in now. The emperor looked at the young lady intently and said that the knight had been found and was already being taken to the palace to be treated. The young lady looked at the emperor in surprise and asked if he was really wounded. The emperor sighed heavily and looked at the lady and said that she should first take care of her own injuries and not worry about the knight's health. The young lady in turn looked at the emperor in surprise but said nothing. The emperor, sighing heavily, said that he would tell her the details when they had conducted a thorough investigation. Jerry looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that the knight had told her that the emperor had sent a doctor from the palace to them. She said with a smile that it was a relief, and he would definitely do a great job, and her wounds would soon heal. Elier looked closely at the maid and asked how she was. Jerry smiled and said that she only had a few scratches, and they would heal quickly. Elier S. said that she would definitely make sure that the doctor examined her too. She thanked her maid but told her not to do such a thing in the future. She looked at her maid intently and said that they both felt pain, and the difference in status did not reflect the difference in the value of life. Jerry froze in place, but did not answer. The young lady thought for a moment. She had earlier, Eller never thought that the count would break the law. She was very surprised that his family abandoned him. After all, he was the eldest son. His speed and strength aroused her interest. She knew that something was wrong. She was puzzled and had something more important to worry about. She wondered how the emperor had found her so quickly. She was, of course, very grateful to him for saving her life. But she in turn was surprised and excited, since she did not understand what kind of facial expression she saw then. The young lady sighed heavily and pushed her thoughts away, as she knew that she needed to stop thinking about everything and needed to take care of her wounds first. She knew that the count would be tried, so she could stop thinking about him and would hear news soon. Balta. O looked down at the floor and sighed heavily as he told the emperor that he had no excuse. He said that he held the honorary title of Imperial Knight, but he had failed to protect the lady, and for that reason he would accept any punishment. The emperor sighed heavily, and looking at the knight said that he was the one he had chosen personally, And of course, it was unforgivable for him to lose in a normal situation. He sighed heavily and said that the Count had a very interesting thing. The Emperor slowly picked up the small ring and showed it to his knight. He asked the knight if he had ever seen anything like it. Balta sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he had not seen anything like it. The Emperor said that this artifact is very helpful in battle, and anyone who wears it will become stronger than an ordinary knight. The knight looked at the Emperor in surprise and asked if he hadn't created an agency responsible for artifacts when he ascended the throne. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that it was true. The Emperor said that these artifacts were created in ancient times, but the magic disappeared over time, and now such objects pose a danger to the world. For this reason, having become the Emperor, he decided to collect all the artifacts. But some are still somewhere in the Empire, and they are difficult to find. He sighed heavily and thought. He said that if the artifacts were stolen from the palace, then they would have to break the arms and legs of the one who was on guard. The Emperor thought for a moment and said that it seemed that the ring was not on their lists, so he only had to take care of the Count. He did not understand where such a piece of trash, with no connections, got this artifact from. He looked at the Count with fury and asked if he really thought that he was allowed to do anything as long as he wore this ring. The Emperor looked at the Count and said that he had miscalculated when he decided to attack the lady and not him. The Emperor said that if she had died, his family would have followed her. But luckily, his parents had disowned him, and he was going to simply cut off his fingers one by one. A moment later, the Emperor froze in place as he remembered that the young lady had said that the Count could not be killed and that he must be punished according to the law. The Emperor sighed heavily. He looked closely at his knight and said that he would forget about his mistake this time. Looking at the knight, the Emperor said that he should recover quickly and return to his duties. The knight looked closely at the Emperor and said that he would do everything and would not make the same mistake again. As he left, the Emperor told his knight that he had assigned more knights to the lady. He also said that Jonathan should go with him to the estate. Balta looked closely at the Emperor and said that they had questioned the coachman and his predecessor. He looked at the Emperor intently and said that the men had reported that they had helped the Count in exchange for gold. The Emperor looked at the knight with fury and said that regardless of the reason, they had helped organize an attack on the future Empress, and they needed to be punished by Suvorov. Balta looked closely at the Emperor and asked what they would do with the Count. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that the future Empress had asked to judge him according to the law. He sighed heavily and said that there had been no talk of a wedding yet, but he really wanted to execute the Count. The Emperor said that she would most likely become his wife, and he must respect her wishes. He looked sideways at his knight and said that he must punish the Count according to the law and throw him into prison. The Emperor said angrily that if the other prisoners accidentally killed the Count, it was not their fault. The knight bowed and told the Emperor that they would do their best. The Count in turn shouted excitedly, but all was in vain. The Emperor sighed heavily as he knew that the young lady was now safe and everything was okay this time. He was very puzzled because he knew that if he had figured out the Count's plans earlier and rushed to help, she would not have had to suffer such terrible injuries. The Emperor was shocked and furious, knowing it was entirely his fault. A moment later, he saw the silhouette of a young lady. She was telling him that he had a beautiful face and he shouldn't frown. She was saying that he was still young and handsome, so he could get anything he wanted if he smiled. She told him to stop risking himself because she was out of place. She said that she would soon be following him around. The Emperor was shocked. He realized that nothing had changed. Even though he had done a lot for this, he wondered if he should just give up. He sighed heavily because he knew that he couldn't do that. He looked at the young lady intently, for he knew that there was no point in him living in this world without her. The news that the former Earl had kidnapped a noble lady hit high society like a storm. Fortunately, the name of the kidnapped lady was not mentioned. The former Earl was locked in a dungeon for attempted murder. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that for the first time in her life, her acquaintance had ended up in the dungeon. The court in turn very quickly passed sentence on the Count. The knight looked at the young lady and said that he was no acquaintance but a criminal. He smiled and told the young lady that she should focus on her wedding. The young lady looked at the knight intently, for now with Sir Balta. She was guarded by another knight. The imperial knight, Jonathan. He looked at the lady with a smile and asked if there was something troubling her. Elier, in turn, thought for a moment, but did not answer. Balta looked at the knight with anger and said that he was too rude. Balta looked at the knight intently and said that the emperor had ordered him to protect Her Majesty. He did not understand what the knight was doing now. He looked at the knight with fury and said that now was not the time to sit around and drink tea. He told Jonathan that he was neglecting his duties. O young lady looked at the knight and said that she herself offered him tea. Jonathan looked closely at the knight and said that it was true. Looking at the knight, he said that Her Majesty was worried because he was too tense. Balta was shocked and yelled at the knight, saying that he was too relaxed. The young lady could see that they were complete opposites. She wondered if they could handle her defense. Jonathan looked at the knight with a smirk and asked if he really doubted his abilities so much that he was afraid to even drink tea. Balta looked at the knight with anger and asked what he was saying. The young lady glared at them and said that they should stop as their words were making her even more nervous. She said that she was just wondering who was controlling the Count's actions. Jonathan thought for a moment, and looking at the young lady, asked if she really thought there was someone else who was pulling the Count's strings. She looked closely at the knight and said that she initially thought that the Count had kidnapped her out of a desire for revenge. She knew that the man was too weak to defeat the knight, and she also heard that he possessed an artifact that was not even known in the palace. She was puzzled that he had such a valuable thing, so someone in power used the simple-minded Count to harm her. Jonathan looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if anyone came to mind. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was just thinking. However, their reaction confused her. She sighed heavily and said that it didn't matter. Jonathan looked at the young lady closely and asked if she didn't want answers. She sighed heavily and said she did, but she didn't think they could answer. She said they treated her as if she were already an empress. Only she knew where their loyalty lay. She looked at them intently and said that they would not tell more than His Majesty would allow. Jonathan looked at the young lady intently and said with a grin that her words would cut him. She smiled and said that she did not judge them at all, and she even respected such knightly devotion. She knew that she could become a useful political tool. Therefore, it was unwise to share important information with her. She was already grateful that the emperor gave her more knights after the kidnapping. She looked at them with a smile and said that she was going to read, and asked if they would like to join her. Jonathan looked at the young lady with a smile and said that they would go with her, since knights should not leave their lady. He said that he would be ashamed if an enemy struck him from behind. The knight looked at the young lady closely and asked her what she thought of the emperor. She frowned and said that he handled liquor well. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that she just thought he was resistant to alcohol. Jonathan looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that he had heard that women got nervous when their wedding day approached. She asked in surprise if he was talking about pre-wedding jitters. She said that she really was marrying an important man. She looked at the knight intently and said that when the wedding was over, she would find out how much they had spent on it. The knight froze in shock as he saw that the lady did not look like an ordinary bride at all. She looked at them and asked if they would let her read alone. The knight smiled and said they would be outside the door. She looked at them intently and said they asked what she thought of the emperor. She looked at them with a smile and said that she would like to ask a counter-question since they had known each other for a long time. She asked if the emperor was capable of loving another person. Jonathan looked after the young lady and said with a smile that he understood everything, and now it dawned on him why the emperor had decided to marry unexpectedly. Jonathan asked his friend if he understood. Since he understood right away, Balta looked at his friend in bewilderment and said that he had no idea what he was talking about. Jonathan smiled and said that he should know about the wishes of His Majesty, since he serves him. The young lady sighed heavily. She did not answer the knight's question, but she still wondered what she really thought about the emperor. She was shocked, because she knew he was just a weirdo who accepted a proposal from a drunk woman. She knew he was an emperor who was definitely not of this world. She understood perfectly well that when they got married, she would have to live in the palace, together with him. She was sure that the emperor would not ignore her, but she understood that she should not count on him. Eller knew full well that she would become a target for the new nobility, and would probably have to spend her entire life in fear of assassins at night. Their wedding was convenient, mainly for the aristocrats interested in expanding their influence. She knew that the average old aristocracy did not have a lady suitable for the emperor by age. However, the average new signs had many candidates. She knew that none of them would be able to interfere with the wedding, because the old families would not like it. She had already memorized all the information about the families who were active in political life. She knew it was useless until she had a chance to talk to the heads of such families. She wondered if she would have a safe palace. She never found out who the real criminal was. Elior knew that when she began to live in the palace, there would be no one to trust nearby. She understood that she would not be able to protect herself. And for the emperor, the lives of the knights were a priority. And for the new aristocracy, she would immediately become a target. She knew that, unfortunately, her future was not determined. She was puzzled and did not know how she could survive in this situation. If her life did end up in danger, she wondered if the emperor would come to her aid, like he had done last time. She was angry with herself and knew she shouldn't have any illusions. She sighed heavily and knew that it was just pre-wedding jitters. Thoughts of life in the palace drove her into melancholy. She sighed heavily because she knew that she was too self-confident. Ellerslie knew that she would never guess what would happen next. Ever since the groom was chosen for her, she knew that one day she would get married. She thought about it because she realized that the broken engagement was a blessing. She found herself another groom with lightning speed. She was puzzled and simply could not believe that she would soon become Empress. She knew perfectly well that if she couldn't escape, she could at least see how it would all end. The young lady was puzzled and did not know how to behave correctly and how to protect herself. She looked at us, the seamstress, in surprise and asked why she needed so many outfits. Madame looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was less than she had originally planned. The lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she would even take away the books about the emperor's family. She asked the maid to leave them. Jerry sighed heavily and said that this was the countess's order, since Madame said that the lady might guess to change the covers and start reading something unnecessary. The lady looked at Jonathan and asked if he knew anything about the emperor's interests. Jonathan said with a smile that the emperor tortures people and reads books. The artist looked at the count and said that it was difficult for him to paint a portrait when he was crying all the time. The lady looked at her parents with a smile, as she knew that time had flown by very quickly, and the wedding day was rapidly approaching. The man looked at the young lady intently and said that she would wear this crown. He asked if she would like to add more stones. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she should not wear the same crown as the previous empress. The man said with a smile that they had to make a different crown to fit her. So there is room for more changes. The young lady in turn would like to ask for all the stones to be removed. She looked at the man with a smile and said that he could leave everything as it was, since it was enough for her that she was the right size. Ellerslie thought that it was very strange to change the crown, since they were marrying based on personal interests. She knew that if the emperor found a woman he loved, she would have to give up the title of Empress. She sighed heavily, as her heart felt heavy, because she would soon have to leave her home. She did not expect at all that the emperor would treat her as an empress. She in turn hoped that he would at least listen to her. Elior wanted to try and become a worthy empress. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she was simply shining a lyra. Thanked the maid with a smile for the kind words. She knew that the first would be the empress, but she would definitely learn everything. The Asperian Empire began in the era of magic. The founder of the empire killed all the evil dragons and demons to unite these lands. People extolled him. He was for them a blessing from the sun, God. And confirmation of this belief was the fact that all the descendants of the founder were born with the mark of the sun god. Each such emperor contributed to the prosperity of the state. However, one must not forget that history is written by the victors. The current emperor also bore the mark of the sun god, and at the same time, he was called a tyrant and a murderer. The madam smiled and told the young lady that today she was the most beautiful lady in the entire empire. She smiled and said that it was a great honor to help her with the preparations. She smiled and said that she was too young when the previous empress got married. The young lady sighed heavily, as she had been sitting since dawn and was very sleepy. She saw that the wedding was approaching, and the people around were fussing even more. The maid smiled and told the young lady that the muscles in her neck were too tense and she should read less. The lady sighed heavily and said that she was a researcher and could not read less. She was shocked because she was told that she needed to eat less before the ceremony. She was shocked and did not understand how she could live on salad all day. Personally, she thought that weddings were unfair to brides. She was puzzled and did not understand why only the bride had to prepare so carefully. She sighed heavily because she thought that the emperor would certainly not be mocked like that. The madam looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was okay. Elier sighed heavily and said that she was just thinking. The lady smiled and asked if she still couldn't believe that she was getting married. She said that all brides go through this. She sighed heavily and said that she would be lying if she said that she was wrong. But she was worried that the jewels would come off the dress, and she was also embarrassed to ride in a luxurious carriage to the imperial palace while everyone was looking at her. The madam looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that everyone was already waiting for hers. Jonathan looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she was simply irresistible today. He smiled and said that now he clearly understood why the emperor was interested in her. Balta looked closely at the knight and told him to remember his manners. The young lady in turn noticed that they were arguing again. She thought with a smile that they were getting along well. A moment later, she was taken aback. Looking at the maids, she asked where Jerry was, since she had not seen her in the morning. She knew that she had to say goodbye to Jerry since she would not see her again. The young lady frowned as she looked at the maids. She didn't understand why they were so upset. She looked at them intently, not understanding what had happened. Elier looked at the maid with concern and asked why she was crying. Jerry looked away. She could not answer anything. The young lady approached her maid and asked how she could leave when she was shedding tears. Jerry sighed heavily and told her mistress that she would soon become Empress, and for this reason she would never see her again. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked who had told her that Elier looked at her and said that she would definitely come home. The madam looked at the young lady intently and said that she would not be allowed to leave the palace, and she would stay there and find her happiness. Since by entering into marriage, she leaves one family and goes to another. She said with a smile that they would see each other for the last time as mother and daughter. The madame looked at the maid and said with a smile that she knew very well that Jerry had taken care of her daughter, but now she had to be let go. The young lady sighed heavily because no matter how much she thought, she came to one conclusion, that marriage in this empire was unpleasant. A moment later, the young lady handed the bundle to the maid. She looked at the maid with a smile and said that she would not be able to return until what time it was, and perhaps by that time the maid would have already managed to get married. She looked at Jerry with a smile and said that for that reason she would give her her wedding present now. She looked at her mother intently and said that she was not going to prison but just to live in a palace. She came closer to her mother and said that since she got married, her family had become bigger, not changed. She looked at her mother intently and said that for the rest of her days she would be her and her father's daughter, and she promised to come home to see the family portrait when it was finished. She looked at her mother closely and said with a smile that perhaps the emperor would even join her, and they would come together. The knights looked at the young lady closely as they were impressed. The young lady looked at everyone present with a smile and said that she would definitely find her happiness in the palace and return to them. Jonathan looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it was time for them to go. He looked intently at the count and countess. Jonathan slowly walked closer to them, and bowing said that he very much hoped that one day he would bring the emperor and empress to their estate. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she could accept such a wedding gift. She smiled and said that she would rather make the gift a family heirloom. She knew that all the last days seemed unreal, but this event happened. She heard the people's jubilation as they were curious about what kind of person the Empress really was. The young lady, in her turn, was riding in a carriage. She had put on a brave face when she left the estate, but now all her bravery was gone, and she could not believe that she was getting married. She knew that she was marrying a man she could call husband. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that she couldn't panic. She understood perfectly well that she didn't have time to worry now. She thought with a smile that this wedding had been started by alcohol and that it wasn't so bad. If she had stayed with the leech, she would have died from stress. Sometime later, she was informed that they had already arrived at the place. At first, she was sure that she had been drawn into an absurd story, but the emperor fortunately turned out to be a rational man. She looked intently at her future husband, who stood in the distance. She thought the best thing about their marriage was that she could be proud of her choice, even though she made it while drunk. Elier knew that when she reached the top, they would become husband and wife. She looked intently at her companion, who tenderly offered her his hand. She thanked him with a smile on her face. He looked at her intently and asked if she was ready to go. Eliero asked with astonishment and surprise where exactly she should go. He looked at her in surprise and said that they needed to go to the altar and exchange vows to complete the ceremony. The young lady was taken aback, as she had completely forgotten about the vows. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he was in a hurry, as the altar was not going anywhere. Some time later, they arrived at the place. The emperor in turn began to speak the oath first. Looking at the altar, he swore in the name of his ancestors that he would not turn away from the path of glory. A moment later, the young lady also began to take her oath. She was puzzled, for she had remembered the words, but did not know where to place her hand. A moment later, she looked at the emperor intently. He looked at her in bewilderment, not understanding why she was hesitating. She looked at him timidly and asked shyly if she should put her hand on his, or next to it. He looked at her with a smile, and taking her hand, said that the position of the hands did not matter, but only the oath was important. The young lady continued to say her oath. She felt as if she had completed a most difficult task. She knew that the wedding was not over yet, so she would have to smile a lot. Elier understood perfectly well that she had to pretend that today she was the happiest bride in the world. The young lady glanced sideways at the emperor, wanting to see his reaction. She was surprised because she noticed that he was smiling in front of the altar. The madam looked at the empress intently and said with a smile that it was a great honor for her to serve her. Looking at the empress, she said that if something was inconvenient for her, she could immediately say so and they would fix it. Elier sighed heavily, as she didn't even know where to start. She looked at Madame with confusion and surprise, and asked if the Empress must always wear such a dress when she went to bed. The lady said with a smile that of course not, and that this outfit had been chosen especially for the wedding night. The young lady froze in embarrassment, as she had completely forgotten about her wedding night. She sighed heavily as they had reached the inevitable. She expected an ordinary wedding, but she did not expect that her groom would be the emperor himself, and the ceremony turned into a real celebration. Madame Link looked at the empress with a smile and said that the emperor would be coming soon, and she could just wait for him. The young lady's mother told her what happens when a woman gets married, and she had a rough idea of what to expect. She wondered if it was necessary, as she was very tired. She wondered if the emperor would want to postpone everything until tomorrow. Her mother told her that she just needed to lie down. She didn't understand why she had to dress up in such a weird dress. A moment later, the emperor entered the room and noticed that the young lady was tired. The young lady sat down on the sofa with lightning speed. She looked closely at the emperor and said with a smile that the sofa looked very comfortable. She froze in surprise as she noticed that his hair was disheveled. She was surprised because he began to look much more human. The maid looked at the emperor intently and said that they had prepared everything as he had asked the empress. In turn, looked at them in bewilderment. A moment later, she looked at the bottle of alcohol and wondered if they would drink. The emperor looked closely at his wife and said that he had asked the maids to bring the drink as it seemed to be to the empress's liking. She had heard that in the eastern continent, it was customary to drink with your mate on your wedding night, Elier. But that was not the tradition of their empire. She wondered what he was planning. She looked at her husband and said that it was not that. She had tried the most luxurious alcohol in the past, but this was the first time she had seen a gold emblem on a bottle. She really wanted to know the name of the alcohol. He looked at his wife and said, "This drink is specially brewed for the imperial family," but he had completely forgotten what the drink was called. He looked at his wife intently and said that he would pour the drink into her glass. He looked at her puzzled and said that she should not look at him so greedily. She smiled and said that she was not that fond of drinking. He said that he did not mind, But too often her drinking led to problems. She noticed that the emperor must have enjoyed alcohol. She thought with a smile that they had something in common. She knew that this drink was superior to the one she drank at the ball. The emperor looked closely at his wife and said that he was very glad that she liked the drink, but she should be careful as it was very strong. She looked at her husband closely and said with a smile that he need not worry, as she was always ready to fulfill her part of the agreement. The emperor froze in place in surprise. He did not understand what she was talking about. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was now relaxed, so she could get through the wedding night. The emperor froze in shock, as he did not expect her to say something like that. He looked at her intently and asked what she was talking about. He timidly said that he didn't quite understand what she was talking about and asked if she was already drunk. Elier looked at her husband closely and said that it was not so. It was just that the alcohol had given her the courage to speak frankly. He looked at her closely and said that in that case, she could tell him everything that was on her mind. Elier said that she did not understand why he proposed to her, since her family had no desire to get involved in state affairs, but she would still do her best to become a good empress. She said that both of them included spending their wedding night. She looked at him intently and asked if the most important thing for an empress was not to give birth to an heir. She said that if he had a woman he loved, then she would understand everything. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he did not have any woman. She looked at the emperor intently and said that she was already preparing to raise someone else's child. She said that if necessary, she was also prepared to get a divorce. The emperor said that she did not need to think about such things at all. Elier looked at the emperor in surprise and asked why he had chosen her then. The emperor looked away and said that she would not understand even if he explained. He said that he swears to her that this had nothing to do with politics or women. The young lady looked closely at her husband. She saw that he was not lying. Elier, looking at her husband, said that there were no obstacles to the wedding night. Elier shouted and told him to just take a look. This is what they dressed her up in since they made her wear a thin dress for him. She said that she had already gotten drunk once, and it all ended in marriage. The next such incident could well lead to a wedding night. He looked at her closely and said that he had heard that the first time was quite unpleasant for a woman. He asked if she was not worried about it. He said that they had not married for love, and that it would certainly be difficult for her. The young lady looked at the emperor in surprise and confusion, as she did not understand what he was talking about. She wondered if she looked strange to him. She did not understand what the problem was. He looked at her closely and said that if she wanted proof of their wedding night, they would do it differently. She sighed heavily and agreed with him, but still said that it seemed like he was making things too complicated. She said they would have to go through with it. One day, she didn't understand why he was hurting himself. He cut his arm and said they had time, and they didn't have to rush. Blood dripped slowly onto the bed. He said that she had heard him called that, so he wanted to clear up some rumors first. She looked at him intently and asked if he really wanted a good relationship with her. The emperor froze, as he had not expected such a question. She looked at him intently and asked if he saw her as a woman. The emperor froze, but a moment later he said that he saw a woman in her. He looked at her hard and said he would be very glad if they could avoid quarrels. She looked at him hard and said that it changed the situation completely, and she understood him. She looked at her husband with a smile and said that they could try to be a real couple. She smiled and said that they were already married, so there was no point in them becoming friends. Elier said that they could go straight to a romantic partnership. The emperor left, and the young lady was left alone. In the room, she decided to finish her alcohol. It seemed to her that it was a good idea to start courting each other, but she did not understand why he suddenly ran away. Elier was very glad that they managed to clarify some details, but she still wondered what would happen next. She didn't know what people did in relationships since she had no experience. He didn't answer her, but his face clearly expressed agreement. She knew that the emperor was not what everyone thought he was. The young lady was shocked and did not understand how a man like the emperor could become famous as a tyrant throughout the empire. The young lady in turn knew that, thanks to alcohol, she would sleep soundly. She was very happy that she would be able to get a glass of it at any time in the future. The maid slowly pulled the curtains aside and greeted the empress, as she needed to wake up already. Elier, without opening her eyes, muttered the name of her maid Jerry, and asked her to give her some time to sleep since she had gone to bed late. The maid looked intently at the Empress and said that she was already in the imperial palace. The young lady in turn was taken aback as she realized where she was now. The maid looked at the Empress with a smile and said that she was only here for one day, so she would soon get used to their routine. The young lady stood up slowly. She sighed heavily and said that she simply couldn't believe that she had forgotten about it. She felt like she had drunk too much yesterday. She drank and ate for two, so it was not surprising. Luckily, she tolerates alcohol well, and for this reason, she does not suffer from hangovers. The maid looked at the Empress with a smile and said that she had brought her some cold tea. She asked the Empress if she would like to try it. Elier in turn thanked the maid. She looked at her closely and said that it turned out that they had met yesterday. She asked the maid what her name was. The maid smiled and said her name was Katie. The other maid smiled and said her name was Janet, and from now on they would serve her. She said if she needed anything, she could speak freely of her needs. Katie looked at the Empress with a smile and said that several people had asked for an audience with her. She said that they could prepare her. She asked the Empress if she needed help with changing clothes. The Empress looked at them in surprise and asked why she needed such help. The maid looked at the young lady closely and said that yesterday was her wedding night, so her back might hurt and they would be very careful with her when bathing. The young lady timidly and embarrassedly said that she was fine. She knew very well that nothing happened yesterday, so she did not have any pain. She was puzzled because she knew that now her every step would be watched. The maids bathed her, dressed her, and quickly dressed her up. Madame looked at the Empress and said with a smile that she could call her simply Madame Johann. She said that she would teach her palace etiquette. Madame said that it was already clear that she had a long way to go. Since when she received the request for an audience, she had to meet the visitors in the drawing room, and she was puzzled since this was only her first task. She did not think that she would be immediately reprimanded. Madame looked closely at the Empress and said that an educated lady would not allow such a blunder. The young lady, in turn, had difficulty restraining herself from arguing, as in her academic years. She knew that she had to restrain herself since she was an empress. She understood that she could not show her emotions while performing her duties. The Empress looked at Madame intently and asked for forgiveness. She said that she had only just started living in the palace yesterday and had a lot to learn. She said that she would certainly remember her advice and would go out to the guests herself. Madame looked at her intently and said that, of course, that was what she should do. Madame looked at the Empress with a grin and said that since she lived in the countryside, she probably knew nothing about the capital and the affairs of high society. The young lady in turn looked at Madame with a smile. She could barely contain her emotions. The men looked at Madame intently and asked how the meeting with the Empress had gone. Madame looked at those present in surprise and said that she had not expected to see them here. The lady looked at the man in surprise and asked why the Minister of Finance had come to the Empress personally. The minister smiled and said that he had heard that the lady would be at the palace, so he decided to drop in. He asked if she would like to continue their conversation in the garden. She looked at the minister in surprise and asked what exactly he wanted to talk about. He smiled and said that he simply wanted to know more news about the Empress. The man standing next to him shuddered. He stood silently and listened to their conversation. Madame sighed heavily and said that the Empress was just a child who had hidden behind books in the village all her life. She knew that nothing would help her here. She had no support or power, and she only knew how to smile naively. The young lady, in turn, knew that there was nothing complicated in the palace etiquette, and she needed to pay more attention to the management of the empire. She knew that she needed to become a professor. She was sure that she had studied everything in relation to etiquette. She wondered if she had missed something. She wanted to get rid of unnecessary lessons as soon as possible. She was a young empress who had studied in the village all her life, but had honed her strategic thinking while writing research. She had brilliantly demonstrated that she could always put pressure on Madame with the help of the title of Empress. Some time later, the man knocked on the Empress's office door and told her that he had allowed himself to enter. She wondered if the next guest would also dislike her manners. She knew that in that case, she would have to agree to Madame's lessons. The man looked intently at the Empress and greeted her. He timidly looked towards me and said that he was the secretary of the empire, and today he would be her assistant. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect that she would have an assistant. He looked closely at the young lady and said that the emperor had ordered him to help her with her many duties. The young lady, in turn, was very much puzzled, as she knew that he should have told her that she would be working with someone. She knew that they were a couple, and he should share with hers. She looked at the man intently and said with a smile that in that case she relied on him very much. He looked at the Empress intently and said that he was simply a Jew, so she could call him by his name, and there was no need for formalities at all. He looked at her intently and said that, unfortunately, after the death of the previous Empress, things had gone badly, and there was no order. The ministers of the interior were unable to cope with the organization. He looked at the young lady and said that this was her first day, so she could just look at the papers and start tomorrow. He asked if she would be able to figure out the accounting of the funds. Elier. She looked at the papers. She wondered what it was. She sighed heavily, and looking at the documents, said that she had studied financial literacy and even given a report on the subject. The man sighed heavily as he realized that she had no experience at all. He said that, unfortunately, the documents in the palace were not kept in the usual way. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she understood everything and they could see each other tomorrow. She said that he could go. As he left, he looked at her intently and said that he also had to pick up the documents from the emperor's office and bring them to her. He said that, unfortunately, the papers were piling up quickly, so she needed to look at them quickly. She looked at him with a smile and said that she would definitely try to get everything done on time. She sighed heavily as she knew that she had held her emotions in check very well. A moment later, she called out to her maids and told them to bring her a drink. The Empress looked at her maids and said that she would like to visit the library and asked if they could show her the way. The maids said that they would show her everything, but they were a little surprised. Since usually the servant is supposed to sit in front of the Empress, she said that everything was fine, and she did not want to tire them out all day. She looked at her maids and asked if they knew anything about Madame and the secretary. She said that rumors would do. The maid thought for a moment and said that Madame gives etiquette lessons to young ladies from noble families, and she has power in social circles. Katie said with a smile that the secretary is quite famous in the palace, as he is the first commoner to be chosen as His Majesty's secretary. The young lady thought for a moment, as she realized that Madame was furious that she had to teach an empress without connections and power, and the secretary did not like the fact that he had to help her and not the emperor. She sighed heavily as she understood that an empress without the manners of elegance and status would be treated badly. She was puzzled and thought that it was simply unfair. She felt that something unpleasant was coming into her. She was furious because she knew perfectly well that not everyone would like her in the palace, but the fact that she did not live up to their expectations did not give them the right to treat her like dirt. She looked at the maid intently and asked if there was any book she was looking for in the palace library. The maid looked at the Empress intently and said that she had heard that there were many ancient books there. She wanted to study all the literature related to etiquette and bookkeeping. The Empress said that it seemed that the library had books on every subject. The handmaid said that it was exactly like that, and a copy of every book written in the empire should be presented to the palace. Elier said that it would be very funny if such books were found. The maid looked at the Empress in surprise and asked what she was talking about, since they did not understand. Some time later, the young lady entered the library and beamed with happiness, as there were many books there. The maid said that unfortunately, the emperor had fired the librarian. The Empress asked, in surprise, if it was him, but simply fired him for no reason. The maid said that she was not sure, but the books were sorted, so they could help her. The young lady thought for a moment, as she did not know what had already served as the reason for the dismissal. She knew that the emperor was not what they said about him, so it was difficult to make any assumptions. She knows that she was the one who suggested becoming a normal couple, but unfortunately, she didn't know how to talk to her partner about sensitive topics. She looked at the maids intently and said that she would find the books she needed herself, and also asked for forgiveness for making them do hard work. The maid looked at the Empress in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at the maids with a smile and said that they should bring her all the novels that were in the library. And the plot did not matter, since she needed books where the heroes sincerely loved each other. The maids were taken by surprise, as the Empress's request was a surprise to them. She spent half her life in the academy and received 3 degrees. And it was not only her innate intelligence that helped her. She kept reading and looking for solutions to various problems until she achieved success. However, there was always one subject that was unclear to her, and now she was talking about love and relationships, because for her it was all very difficult. Elier understood perfectly well that since she now lived in the palace, she had to study from books from the emperor's library. The maid looked at the empress intently and said that she had found all the novels she had spoken of. She looked at the empress in surprise and asked if they would help her. The young lady understood perfectly well that to master etiquette, it was enough to remember the rules. She was well versed in finances, so she quickly got used to the palace documentation. Elier looked at the maid and praised her for her work. She said that she needed to study something. She knew that there were many books in the library here, and it would take her several years to complete everything. The maid looked closely at the empress and said that she seemed to be very keen on reading. The empress said that this was true, and if she had not succeeded in getting married, she would have joined the ranks of scholars. The maid looked at the empress in surprise and asked if she also read novels for some kind of research. The empress looked at the book with a smile. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She smiled and said that books about love were rare in the academy. The maid smiled and said that it was understandable, since they were not considered educational. The empress thought that the maid thought it was very strange, but she could not reveal the truth. She didn't know how to explain to her that she and her husband had done nothing on their wedding night. She couldn't tell that they decided to become a real couple first. The empress frowned for a moment, as she could not draw any pattern from the books. The maid looked at the empress in surprise and said that this was very strange, since there were not enough books in the library. Elier looked at the maid and said that she was just trying to understand how couples behaved. A moment later, she froze in shock as she saw the emperor. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing in his library. He looked at the list of possible situations in surprise. The young lady looked at the emperor with confusion. She wondered if he was busy. She hoped that he would not read this list in public. She wanted him to understand that her maids could hear everything. The empress looked at the maid and asked if she could leave them. The empress looked at the emperor intently and asked him to be more careful in front of the servants. He looked at her intently and said that he was just curious about what kind of list she was keeping. The young lady looked at her husband closely and said that she was going to show it to him when she had written down a few more examples. She said that perhaps they could discuss them. She asked if he would like to sit down and discuss them now. She looked at the emperor intently and said that he could not sit there as it would be too obvious. He looked at her hard and said he didn't see a problem with it. She looked at him hard and said he shouldn't forget they were partners. She said that the partners were sitting together and he should take the seat next to her. He looked at her in surprise and said that there was also a chair opposite her. He did not understand what the difference was. She looked at him intently and said that she meant that he should sit next to her, even if there were other seats. The emperor sighed heavily, but still obeyed her order. The young lady in turn saw that he did not understand anything, but still resigned himself to her. She glanced sideways at the emperor in embarrassment and said that she wanted to ask him one question. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she would like to ask. She looked at him intently and said that he had said earlier that he was not in love at the moment. She asked if he had been in a relationship before, and if he had any experience with this. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted to avoid unnecessary conflicts, so she was trying to take into account all the variables before talking to him. The emperor in turn looked at his wife intently and in surprise. He asked in surprise if this had anything to do with the list she had prepared. She smiled and said that it was exactly like that. She said that there had been people before, and he couldn't read her list, but now they were alone and he could read it. He began to slowly read the list she wrote, that there was a high probability of the emperor's past love appearing. He said that this would not happen to them, and did not understand why this should be taken into account. She looked at him intently and said that you often see this kind of thing in popular novels. She said that their situation was different, so she was going to gradually narrow down the options. Since they fell under the category of marriages of convenience, he asked in surprise what role the minor male character played. She smiled and said that it was very interesting. She looked at the emperor intently and said with a smile that he does everything for the heroine, but she does not love him. Although sometimes a minor male character becomes the main character, he sighed heavily and said that it seemed like it was the heroine who decided who would be the main character. The emperor frowned for a moment, not knowing what to say. He sighed heavily and said that the heroine would be happy if she made the right choice. She looked at her husband intently and said that the possibility of a minor male character could be ruled out since she had no men in her life. Moments later, she noticed that he was tearing up her list. The young lady was shocked. The emperor said that the list was useless because reality was different from the books. The empress said that she was very serious, and she understood perfectly well that the information was found in novels. He looked at her intently and said that he was very serious about their marriage. The emperor said that he could swear that he had no other, and they would not quarrel so about this. He said that problems could arise only because of him. He looked at her intently and said with a smile on his face that if it came to a quarrel, he would definitely deserve her forgiveness. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this was the power of a handsome man. She wanted him to stop looking at her with such a smile, because she might have misunderstood him. She looked at him intently and still said her thoughts out loud. She asked him to stop looking at her with such a smile, as she would misunderstand him. She sighed heavily and said that it might still come in handy. She looked at the emperor intently and said that she had received important information while reading. She said that there had to be a certain degree of intimacy between them to begin with. She looked at the emperor with confusion and said that they were a couple, and they also wanted to get to know each other better. She said that they should use their names when communicating or nicknames. She looked at him intently and, breathing heavily, said that etiquette dictated that they should use titles, and they could do so. The emperor agreed with her. She asked in surprise what he agreed with. He looked at her intently and said that they could call each other by their first names. She looked at him intently and said that her parents always called her Ellie. She looked at the emperor intently and asked what about him. He said that she could call him Rofers. Some time later, they went outside because they wanted to take a walk. The young lady looked at the emperor with a smile. She thought that they would get along with each other in time. She felt relieved by this. She saw that the emperor was very quiet, but he listened to her attentively. She thought with a smile that she should offer him tea next time. She knew that everything would be fine between them, as that was the life of a real couple. The young lady was completely puzzled. She was distracted and forgot to ask him about something important. She knew that she needed to inquire about the fate of the librarian and clarify something. She sighed heavily, knowing she would have to ask him about it later. She was a little puzzled because after the Count's attack, no one had angered her. But as soon as she got to the palace, she already had her irritants. She spent more time with the secretary than with Madame. For this reason, she gave the documents all her attention. She was shocked because they all used inefficient methods of counting. She saw that the recording method was outdated. She saw that the secretary's notes were very strange. She wondered if it was a mistake or if he did it on purpose. She knew that he did not consider her a fool who could not read. The maid looked at the Empress intently and asked her if she did not like the food. She was worried that she had not touched anything. The Empress said that the food was very good, and she liked the food in the palace. She said with a smile that she was very pleased to sit and watch the garden while she ate. The maid said that it would soon become hot and asked the Empress if she should bring them a canopy. The Empress said that she would not eat on the terrace all the time. She just wanted to have a snack and then get back to the schedule. The maid looked at the Empress in surprise, as she knew that she had no meetings today. The Empress said that this was exactly the case, but unfortunately, the work did not disappear, and she had to talk to her subordinate. The Empress looked at the secretary and said that she had checked the documents and noticed inaccuracies. She said that he was still moving his things and therefore was busy, and she understood this. She said that everyone around him called him a good assistant, but she asked him to check his notes and bring back a corrected version. He apologized and said he wasn't sure he understood her. She smiled and said she would tell him straight out that he had made a huge number of mistakes. She said she had visited the library to find out how this had happened and had read books and documents containing up-to-date information on record keeping. She looked closely at her assistant and said that she had also reviewed the Home Office records and was satisfied that they were keeping records in accordance with the new standards. She looked at the assistant closely and said with a smile that for this reason he had to redo everything so that she could sign her names. She knew she was angry and it was not her style, but she would still have to work as a souvenir for a long time, so she used a different approach to the conversation. Earlier, the professor told her in the same tone about the mistakes in her research. It was painful to hear the criticism, but now she understands that he was not mistaken, and the professor also expressed everything calmly, so they avoided an argument. Jaren sighed heavily and told the Empress that he realized he had made a mistake. She saw that he readily admitted everything she hoped that her peaceful approach had worked. He angrily took the documents from her desk and said that from now on, he promised not to allow even the slightest inaccuracy. He looked at her intently and said angrily that she should also do her duties on time. The young lady was shocked as she noticed that he was not going to work in harmony with her at all. He said that he would be grateful to her if she would review the documents during the day. As he left, he said that he would certainly return to his duties. The young lady was shocked because looking at his character, he was more like the main one than she. She was shocked and wondered if he really didn't like working with her. She didn't understand why the others in the palace valued him so much. The maid thought for a moment and said that the secretary was very cold but polite. Janet Wu smiled and said that if he was born an aristocrat, he could become the chief secretary in the future. The young lady was puzzled and did not understand why he was acting so rudely towards her. She was puzzled and knew that she did not demand unquestioning obedience or loyalty from him. Looking at the secretary, she wondered why he was so hostile towards her. She didn't know what he had to gain from all this. She sighed heavily and thought that she shouldn't bother her head with such things, because if he just didn't like her, then there was nothing she could do about it. She knew she had to focus on her work, as she hadn't thought there would be so much paperwork. She saw that the work was similar to what noble ladies did. She knew that rich noble families often helped the slums, but she was confused, as she didn't know what kind of charity groups there were in the empire. She saw a report on the development of a small town for the first half of the year. She froze for a moment because she didn't understand what it was. She knew that it didn't look like her job. She thought it was all strange because she knew the roads there needed repairs. She saw that they were planning to start work. A moment later, she realized that she shouldn't read such documents, since documents that concerned the welfare of the empire were the emperor's work. She didn't understand why he gave them to her. She wondered if he was really trying to make her life difficult. She sighed heavily because she knew that now she would be suspicious of him all the time. She looked closely at the secretary and said that it seemed that he had accidentally given her the emperor's document. She wondered which of them was the assistant. He looked angrily at the Empress and asked if he really looked that stupid. The young lady looked at him in anger and wondered if she was a fool to whom someone else's papers could be foisted. Gritting her teeth, she looked at the secretary and said that it was the emperor who should make such decisions. He said that the emperor personally handed over these documents to him in the morning. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She froze in place and wondered if the emperor really trusted her with such decisions. She was a little worried because she knew that the empress should not be involved in such matters. A moment later, they heard some noise outside the door. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked what was wrong. The maid smiled, looking at the empress. She said that they should take a short break. The maid said with a smile that the emperor had arrived to see them. The empress looked at the emperor in surprise and asked why he was there, as she knew he must be busy. He looked at her in surprise and asked if the bet was not supposed to rest together. The emperor said that they could dine together in the fresh air. He looked closely at the empress and asked if he really needed permission from his personal assistant. Jaren sighed heavily and told the emperor that that would not be necessary. He looked at the emperor closely and said that he very much hoped that their dinner would go well. As she left, the empress looked intently at the secretary and said that she would not be long and asked him not to overwork himself. The man was furious as he was disgusted by the fact that he had to read about recipes and holiday dishes. He did not understand why he had to deal with women's work that had accumulated over many years. He had worked so hard for this position. He didn't understand why he had to deal with such nonsense. He was furious and didn't understand why he had to curry favor with the pathetic Empress. After all, she was just a toy for the Emperor. The young lady looked at her husband intently and said with a smile that she was very surprised when he came. The Emperor froze in place when he saw his wife's radiant smile. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was silent. He froze in place and said that, unfortunately, he was not used to hearing his name. She looked at him in surprise and said that they had agreed to use the names themselves. He sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. She looked at him with a smile and said that there were no servants or knights around, so he could relax and call her by name. The young lady looked closely at her husband as she noticed that he was embarrassed. She did not understand why he was embarrassed, because for such a thing she found it funny since their relationship was now progressing better than any other affairs in the palace. She looked at her husband closely and said that his secretary was very good, but she did not understand why he gave him to her. The Emperor said that the man was very good at his business, and he decided that they would get along. She looked at her husband closely and said, they were still getting used to working together. She knew that if she said they argued all the time, it would sound like complaining, and her pride wouldn't survive it. The Emperor looked closely at his wife and said that the secretary was a quick learner and knew how to think, so she would find such a person useful. The man looked at the Emperor intently and said that his name was Jaren and Lady Elir taught him. He tried to stop her many times, but she said everything would be okay, and then the inevitable happened. The young lady Song looked at her husband and said that there was something she didn't understand. She said that she knew that an empress had more responsibilities than an ordinary lady. She said she should help the slums create charity groups, also engage in the construction of roads that lead to remote regions, also look for aristocrats who evade taxes. She looked at the emperor and said that all this was important state work, but she had never heard of the empress participating in it. She looked at the emperor intently and asked if he had given her all this work because he was sure she could handle it. The young lady said timidly that unfortunately she had little experience, but she understood what was part of her duties. He looked at her closely and said that he wanted her to make her own decision. He came closer to her and said that the emperor and empress should work together and strive for common goals, and the final decision should be made by the wiser and more reasonable person. He smiled and said that if there were no more such empresses, she would become the first. The lady looked at the empress intently and said with a smile that she was honored to become her new assistant. She said that, unfortunately, she had little experience. She looked closely at the empress and said that she was afraid that she might become a burden to her, but she would make every effort. The empress looked intently at the young lady, who looked at her with a radiant smile. The empress looked at her husband closely and said that he was right, but she was still a little puzzled. He looked at her closely and said that he was sure that she would be happy with such a job. Eller knew that all this was true, and she was interested in these questions. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately they were not in the academy, and she could not study only what she liked. The empress looked closely at her husband and said that he should have discussed this issue with the council first. She said that even she thought the change was too sudden. She wondered what the old-timers would think. He sighed heavily and said he would discuss it if she said so. The young lady looked at her husband in bewilderment. He looked at her intently and said that it seemed he had placed too great a burden on her, which was beyond her strength. The young lady froze in shock, wondering what he had just said. He looked intently at his wife and said that his secretary would later take the documents to his office, and he would sign everything himself. The young lady was taken aback and firmly refused him. She came closer to him and, taking his hand, said that she would definitely cope with this job. She said that she simply meant that he made a hasty decision. The emperor froze in shock, did not expect this from her. She said that she did not want this to reflect badly on the emperor. She looked at her husband intently and said that people might think she was trying to take power away from him. Elir looked at the emperor and said that he himself said that they should make decisions together, and in that case, he should guide her in doing the work. She asked if she could approve every document that came across her desk. The emperor frowned for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he froze. He asked if she could let go of his hand. The young lady in turn thought about this situation for a moment. He sighed heavily and said that he was not very interested in politics, so he decided that she would handle such issues better. He looked at her intently and said that he could take care of the formalities so that she could ignore them and concentrate on work. She didn't fully agree, but he insisted. At that moment, she asked him to appoint a new assistant who would share the duties with the current secretary. The Empress looked at the girl with a smile and said that she was very glad to meet her, and she was probably very surprised by the unexpected change of scenery. The girl smiled and said that she had finished her previous work and was ready for a new one. The Empress smiled and told her that she need not worry as her duties had not changed much. She smiled and said that she would certainly try to do all the work. The Empress looked at the girl with a smile and said that she really liked her positive attitude. She glanced sideways at the secretary as she could see that the other assistant was not in a very good mood today. The young lady looked at the Empress and asked if she should question the secretary about her tasks. The Empress looked at her with a smile and said that they should go somewhere first. The young lady was surprised, as she did not know where they were going. The Empress asked the secretary if he knew her schedule. He looked at the Empress and said that she had an etiquette lesson with Madame today. The Empress smiled and said that she would give her her time. She looked at the secretary and asked him to work on his own. The man glanced sideways at the departing Empress. He was very angry. He looked sideways at the young lady and said that it was very good when she was young and an aristocrat and could be hired for nothing. The Empress looked at the young lady and asked if she understood palace etiquette. Murin said with a smile that she did not understand it completely, but she knew how to act in certain situations. She said that she had spent almost her entire life in the academy, so she knew little about the local rules. The Empress asked the lady if she had heard of Madame Johann. The lady said that she had not studied with her, but knew that she often helped girls from old families. The Empress looked closely at her assistant and asked if she could observe the lessons and tell if she was being taught correctly. The young lady was surprised, as she had previously heard that Madame was a wonderful teacher. She looked intently at the Empress and asked her to understand correctly. She said that there were many who wanted to take the place of her assistant. She looked at the Empress intently and asked why she had been chosen. She wanted to know if it was because she was a woman. She said that she had previously done simple paperwork and knew little about etiquette. The Empress looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really thought she had been chosen as a personal servant. The young lady was taken aback and said that she had not even thought about it. The Empress smiled and said that she was very glad that the girl asked a direct question that interested her. The Empress said that she had received many big cases from the Emperor, and she decided that they could not handle the secretary themselves, and this was the reason for looking for a new assistant, and she needed someone who could help. So she checked the exam results. The Empress looked closely at the lady and said that she had not paid any attention to family or gender. She was simply the most suitable for the job. The Empress smiled and said that she needed someone who was truly talented. She told the girl that she was quite capable of working on large, high-level tasks. Elier. She looked closely at her assistant and said that today was her first day of etiquette, and unfortunately, something was bothering her, so she would like the assistant to observe them at least once. The young lady looked at the Empress with a smile and agreed with her. She said that she would not take her eyes off her. Some time later, the Empress entered the room, and looking at Madame, said that she had come very early. Madame N frowned, looked at the Empress, and said that she would now be her teacher. She told the Empress that she was higher in status than her, which obliged her to come earlier. The Empress looked sideways at Madame. She wondered if she shouldn't have stood when she entered. She looked at Madame with a smile and said that she valued her time too, and from that day on, she should come at the beginning of the lesson. The Madame looked at the Empress in surprise and asked what lady was accompanying her. The Empress smiled and said that this was her assistant, and she worked with her. The young lady greeted the Madame and said that she had heard a lot about her. Murin looked at the Madame intently and said with a smile that she had only been trained in paperwork, so she would like to know a little more about palace etiquette. The Madame looked at the young lady intently and said that her pursuit of knowledge was commendable. She told the young lady to listen carefully but quietly and not to distract the Empress. She realized that since she had never heard of this name, it meant that her family was insignificant. Elie glanced sideways at her assistant and said with a smile that since she would not be participating in the lesson, she could just sit and watch them. Madame looked closely at the Empress, as she knew that she and her assistant knew nothing about etiquette, and that would be very wonderful. Madame looked at those present with a smirk and said that it was usually rude to sit in the presence of the one you serve, but she would make an exception. She looked at the Empress with a smirk and said that they could start with the basics. Murin in turn knew that she had studied etiquette diligently as well, so she would take the chance to brush up on her knowledge. At the Empress intently, and said that she already knew how to greet guests, but now she would be meeting people whose status was lower than her. She said that even if the Empress were to use emotions, she should try not to show it with words and facial expressions. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that her words had meaning, since a person's words can be misinterpreted. Madame smiled and said that noble ladies express their opinions with their fans. She was sure that the lady had encountered this at receptions. Elie looked closely at the fan since she had only been to the ball once and had only thought about alcohol, so she did not remember anything. Madame looked closely at the Empress and told her to repeat after her. She looked at the Empress and said that if she wanted to show that she was ready to greet someone, she should repeat the corresponding movement. The young lady froze in shock, but said nothing. The Empress looked at Madame in surprise, and since these movements seemed not very correct to her, Madame looked at the Empress with a smirk and told her to hold the fan in the same way. The Empress froze in shock, and looking at Madame wondered what she was doing. The Madame looked intently at the Empress and said that she could lower her fan and beckon the guest to her. The young lady in turn froze as she understood that this was complete nonsense. She looked at Madame surprised and puzzled and asked if she was really not joking now. She wondered if Madame really thought she was completely stupid. The young lady looked at Madame intently as she immediately seemed suspicious to her. She thought that her assistant had noticed it too. The Empress was puzzled as she knew that this was her assistant's first day, and she already looked like she wanted to leave. Madame looked at the Empress intently and told her to repeat after her. The Empress looked at Madame timidly and said that of course she had not had time to prepare thoroughly for life in the palace. But her mother had not mentioned the existence of such a way of greeting. The lady stood frozen in shock, but a moment later she asked the Empress if she really thought she was deceiving her. The Empress in turn hesitated, not knowing what to answer, since she knew that Madame was a very influential woman. Madame came closer to the Empress and looked at her intently. She said that she helped many noble ladies to make their first debut. Madame furiously asked the Empress how she could argue with her and doubt her skills. Elie was furious. She looked at Madame intently and said that she was of course sorry that she hurt her feelings on the very first lesson. The lady was shocked. She didn't even think that Madame was so terrible. She didn't understand how it was possible to teach the Empress such an inappropriate gesture. The Empress looked at the young lady and asked if she also found Madame's lesson strange. The lady looked at the Empress and said that she did not mean to be rude, but Madame taught her disgusting things. She looked at the Empress intently and said that if she behaved like that with the ambassador, the Empress looked at the girl in surprise as she expected her to continue. The girl said that she would become an empress who did not know how to respect representatives of other countries. She screamed that she could already see the headlines, and the Empress would be called the Empress, who forgot about manners and humiliated the ambassador. Eller looked at her assistant in bewilderment. She looked at the assistant intently and asked if this meant that Madame was lying to her. The lady said in a rage that this was not etiquette at all. She said that she did not know exactly how it was customary to behave in the palace, but not like this. She said that she was ready to swear on her father's name that this gesture bordered on insult. The Empress was shocked, since she had learned it with a smile on her face. Murin looked at the Empress intently and said that she was now beginning to understand why the Empress had asked for another assistant. She sighed heavily and said that, as she had said before, she had not been taught by Madame, but she knew that in the palace she had always been friendly with everyone. Previously, she thought that Madame was just kind, but her behavior today was terribly rude, and Madame directly insulted her. The lady said that such a person simply has no right to teach the Empress. The Empress looked at her assistant intently and said that for Madame, she was just a girl from a poor family. She looked at her intently and asked who taught her etiquette. Murin said that she was taught by Baroness Loucher, but she only gave her the knowledge necessary for a servant. The Empress looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what kind of person the Baroness was. The lady said that the Baroness was known in social circles, just like Madame. The Empress looked at the girl in surprise and asked why she was so famous. Murin said that she was nicknamed the Smiling Hummingbird. The young lady sighed heavily. She looked at her assistant in confusion, as she did not understand what this meant. Murin looked at the Empress intently and said that she was sure that the Baroness would never be rude to her like that, and she could contact her if she wanted to. The Empress was surprised and said with a smile that that would be great. The young lady looked at the Empress with a gaze and said with a smile that she had told her herself earlier that she had not chosen her because of her gender or family status. She knew that her skills might not be that excellent, but she could still provide her with the support that only a woman could provide. The young lady looked at the Empress intently and said that her secretary would not be able to help her with such things. She looked at the Empress intently and said that she was very sorry that she had not paid due attention to palace etiquette. She asked the Empress for forgiveness. Elir was shocked because she did not expect such a thing. She thanked the young lady for her help. Elir looked closely at her assistant and said with a smile that she had finally found someone she could rely on. The young lady looked at the Empress in surprise and asked if she was really talking about her now. Jonathan sighed heavily and thought that things were very bad. The knight looked closely at the Emperor and said that the Empress was beginning to trust someone more than the Emperor, and this could be dangerous. The Emperor looked at the knight in surprise and asked, "Did he really come to report such nonsense?" He told him to leave. He told the Emperor that he wanted to focus on his work, but he himself had ordered to keep an eye on the Empress, and he had already gotten rid of anyone who could physically harm the Empress. However, they had a problem with the etiquette teacher. Even though Her Majesty was managing on her own, the Emperor told him to keep an eye on her. Jonathan sighed heavily and apologized for asking. He asked the Emperor if he didn't get along with the Empress. He asked if a married couple shouldn't talk about their problems with each other. He looked at the Emperor intently and said that during their tea party, he always spoke only about the Empress. Jonathan asked the Emperor if he really wanted to give her a gift. Jonathan smiled and said that a silent man may seem attractive to the ladies, but this trait becomes boring if he is quiet after marriage. The Emperor thought for a moment and wondered what kind of gift the Empress would like. Jonathan asked the Emperor for forgiveness, as he should know about his wife's preferences himself. What he said was that the Empress did not like the same things as ordinary women. The knight looked at the Emperor and said that she would definitely appreciate the gift that her husband had chosen, especially for her. The young lady was puzzled because her figures did not add up. She knew that on paper, the road construction was going well, but the amounts did not add up, and she could not allow such a mistake. The Empress looked at her assistant closely and asked if he was sure that the person in charge of transferring the documents had approved them. Jaren looked at the Empress closely and said that all papers only reach the Emperor after the person in charge has approved them. She thought for a moment, since a large sum of money had not been taken into account, and the calculations were all wrong. She did not understand how such a thing could be approved. The Empress sighed heavily and said that she could not close her eyes to this. He sighed heavily and said that even if the finance minister was involved, the documents should have been reviewed very carefully. For a moment he thought, and said that they had cases when librarians appropriated money under the pretext of buying books. The Empress looked at the assistant in surprise and asked if that was really why he was fired. She asked what happened to the one who approved the requests. He looked at the Empress and said that he heard that the man had a small amount deducted from his salary, although for aristocrats it was a trifle. The young lady was shocked. She knew that stealing from the treasury was a crime, and he was not punished at all. He said that the guilty official could not get off so easily, and tension arose between his family and the Emperor. All the nobility interested in the affairs of high society knew this story. She didn't know what kind of tension they had, but the Emperor building the image of a tyrant would not let the criminal go. The young lady looked at her assistant and said that he should give her all the documents of the Minister of Finance, and she would review them. Murin looked at the Empress in surprise and asked if they were not going to work today. She looked at them and said that all papers that were sent to the palace in order to receive funds must be approved. She looked at them intently and said that something was wrong with the Minister of Finance and that she was going to personally take care of the matter. She said that the two of them could leave early. She understood perfectly well that there was a way to find out the truth without contacting the minister directly. She looked at her husband intently and asked if she could ask for something. He looked at her in surprise and said that his permission was not required for anything. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that she knew this, but they needed to discuss it. He asked in surprise what exactly she wanted to discuss. She said that they lived together in the palace and had agreed to help each other. She looked at him intently and said that in the eyes of others, they looked like a couple. The emperor looked at her intently and said that she was absolutely right. She smiled and asked if he would not mind spending the night with her. The emperor froze in shock and asked what she was talking about. She looked at him intently and said that she thought she had made herself clear enough. She smiled and said that he could stay put and just spend the night with her in the same bed. In recent days, all she did was look for inconsistencies in the documents that came to her for verification. She was furious and did not know who was stealing from the treasury. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked why he was looking at her like that. She looked at her husband intently, as she knew that he was her husband and had the greatest power in the empire. She said that he only needed to sleep with her in the same bed and leave in the morning. She looked at him with a smile and asked if his bed was more comfortable. The emperor looked at her and said that he was just curious why she suddenly made such an excuse. She still made him lie down in bed. She said with a smile that everyone expected something like this to happen. He looked at her in surprise and asked why this was so. Elier asked in surprise, did he really not understand? She said that all the newspapers write that their romance is wonderful, and they have maintained a good relationship after marriage, and the fact that they have not slept in the same room since their wedding night may seem strange. He said that they could influence the newspapers, so she didn't need to worry about baseless rumors. She was shocked and said that he was just trying to run away. She asked if he hadn't said earlier that they were both serious about this relationship. She looked at the emperor intently and said that for this reason, she did not want people to think badly of them. He sighed heavily and said that he cared very much about their marriage. The young lady looked at her husband in bewilderment. He looked at her intently and asked if he wanted something more than just sleeping next to her. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about now. He looked at her intently and said that she had said earlier that they should just spend the night in the same bed. He sighed heavily and said that he was a man, and therefore he could change his mind and want something more. He looked closely at his wife and asked if she would object if he went a little further. The young lady froze. She did not understand what he was talking about. Elier looked closely at her husband and wondered if she understood his words correctly. The young lady looked away shyly and said that she wanted to ask him something. She timidly asked if he realized how attractive he was. The emperor frowned, looking at his wife. She constantly looked at him and said that she did not care who was born, first a boy or a girl. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. She said with a smile that thanks to him, the child would certainly turn out to be very cute. She looked at the emperor intently and asked if he saw that he wanted to create an heir with her while they slept in the same bed. She looked at her husband closely and said that she was a little nervous because she had no experience in matters of the heart. But such was her duty. She smiled and said that she very much hoped that their baby would inherit more of his traits than hers. The emperor froze in place from shock. He sighed heavily and said that it was time for them to sleep. She smiled and asked if he would agree to sleep with her. She said that they should talk later about the heir. He said that she could not worry about it, since he did not want to do such a thing with someone who did not want him. She looked at the emperor intently and said that she would have to do it anyway. She asked in surprise if her wish was really that important. The emperor looked closely at his wife and said that if they must, they would return to this issue one day, but not now. The young lady in turn looked at her husband in surprise. A moment later, she asked if he didn't like children. He sighed heavily and said that he rarely had children around, so he didn't know for sure. She sighed heavily and, looking at her husband, said that it seemed like I had a situation, although she was curious. Elier said she was very curious about what kind of child he would have with his face and her brain. She asked if he wanted to know. Rofers asked if parents usually didn't want their baby to look like their mother. She looked at the emperor intently and asked his forgiveness for her frankness, but still said that her brain was the best. While she spoke, she was deadly serious. She looked at him intently and asked if he liked talking to her like this. Looking at her husband, she said that she suggested sleeping together because of the attention people were paying to them. Elier S. said that they can talk freely only when no one is around. Even though they are married, they want to become a real couple. She smiled and said that they would go to bed after they had talked about everything, and the people in the palace would no longer worry about their relationship. She looked at him in surprise and asked what was wrong. He said he felt a little awkward. She smiled and said everything would be fine once he got used to it. With a smile, the young lady said they had a hard day tomorrow, so they might as well get a good night's sleep. He looked at her intently and asked if she would mind sharing his bed. Elier purred and said that they could talk tomorrow, and she fell asleep instantly. She fell asleep, and the emperor was lost in his thoughts. He was puzzled and wondered how he could sleep peacefully next to her. He sighed heavily because he knew that she had already destroyed many of his expectations. He could not open his heart to someone or be happy. He knew that now was not the right time for that. The lady looked at the emperor intently and asked why he did not send letters with marriage proposals. She said that he is very handsome and is a prince, and he has a lot to offer to a partner. She said that he is very good at studying, but for some reason he understands things like this more slowly than she does. He sighed heavily and said that his mother was not from a noble family, so he had no support and influence. He knew that he was a cruel prince, and that even the palace did not want to take care of him. He knew that no one would give their daughter to him. He looked at the lady intently and asked if she would become the wife of such a man. She looked at him with a smile and said that, of course yes, because he had such a great face. She said that was his greatest asset. She smiled and said that she was very smart so she could hold him. He looked at her intently and asked, surprised, what good his face was. He sighed heavily and said that she had a fiancé and she shouldn't say such things. The lady sighed heavily and said that unfortunately her husband was just awful. She didn't know what would happen to her life. She smiled and said that she was sure that he would find a wonderful wife. She knew he was a good man and would find happiness. She doubted that this would happen, but she wanted to tell him. She said that if her engagement was broken off and he had not married by then, she would certainly take care of him, so he should not worry. He looked closely at his wife, who was sleeping quietly. He knew that this was the first time she had come to him herself. He sighed heavily as he thought that perhaps it would be his last. He knew that she loved peace very much, and that was why, in the end, you always made a choice in favor of the greater good. He knew that she would never look at him with the same eyes again, but he knew perfectly well that everything was okay, because she was shining as brightly as the sun. He looked closely at his wife because he knew that in this life, she was the first to find him. He wanted to help her change this world. The maid looked at the Empress intently and said that the Emperor cared about her very much. The Empress looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The maid smiled and said that even the air in the palace had changed a little. Since the day she arrived at the palace, the Empress smiled and said that she had not noticed anything like that. Janet looked at the Empress with a smile and said that it was true. And even the Emperor became softer. They looked intently at the Empress, and with radiant smiles said that he was staying with her for the night. The young lady boss, in turn, was of course very glad that they all believed. They slept together, and her expectations were a little different after reading the novel. But unfortunately, reality caught up with her in the morning when she saw an empty bed. She was surprised and did not understand where he had gone, since he had not even deigned to wake her up. Nadezhda sighed, because it was insensitive on his part. She knew he wanted to get along with her, but he continued to avoid communication. She thought everything was going well, but unfortunately, he was not making contact the way she wanted. She wondered if he was shy or if he had always been this way. The maid looked closely at the Empress and called her. Some time later, the assistant entered the room and greeted the Empress. The Empress looked at her in surprise and asked why she was there. She said that she should have stayed with the Baroness so that she could come and get them. The lady smiled and said that she was the Empress's assistant, so she had to be with her everywhere. The Empress smiled and said that she was very hard-working. Elier looked at her assistant and asked how she found working with Jaren. She said that she heard that he was very reserved and he didn't give her challenging tasks. The Empress in turn was puzzled, since she did not understand how she had deserved such an attitude towards herself on his part. The Empress sighed heavily and said that she had not thought at all that the Baroness would visit the palace so soon. She also agreed to teach her etiquette. The Empress said that she had already managed to make a bad impression on her. The lady said that the Baroness herself had decided to come earlier. The Empress sighed heavily and said that no one would have had to endure any inconvenience if Madame had taught her correctly. The young lady looked closely at the Empress and said that everyone knew who taught her. Eller said that if anyone knew, she would come to the conclusion that it was she who had not tried hard enough, since she had dedicated her entire life to studying at the academy and did not come from a very noble family. The young lady was shocked and did not understand how Madame could do such a thing, since she was now the second person in the empire. The Empress said that she was also confused, since she did not understand aristocrats very well. She asked the assistant if she had any ideas on this matter. The lady sighed heavily and said in a puzzled tone that she had always thought only of studying, but Madame was still very rude to the Empress. The Empress slowly entered the room where the Baroness was. She hoped that she would teach her better. The Empress looked at the Baroness in surprise as she saw her pleasant face. Elier looked at Madame intently, and in surprise as she simply oozed elegance. The young lady greeted the Baroness with all courtesy. She thought she should have greeted the Baroness too, while they kept it a secret, but she was still her teacher. Elier looked at Madame intently and greeted her with a smile. She said that she was really looking forward to their lessons together. The young lady looked at the Baroness in surprise, as she did not understand why the atmosphere had suddenly become so heavy. The Baroness looked intently at the Empress, and asking for forgiveness, asked permission to say something. The young lady looked at the Baroness in surprise and asked if something was wrong. The Baroness smiled and said that she had not said that the lesson had begun. The Baroness said that in the palace, everyone should be the first to greet the Empress and the Emperor, and if she addressed her first in public, then everyone would think that it was she who showed disrespect to the Empress. The Baroness looked at the Empress intently and said that she would certainly be punished for insulting the imperial family. The Empress froze in place in shock, as she did not expect such a thing. The Empress asked for forgiveness in a puzzled tone, as she did not want to. She asked if she always had to wait for a person to say hello. The Baroness sighed heavily and said that it all depended on the situation, but usually it was like that. The Baroness said that she was sure that the Empress had learned the basics of etiquette before moving into the palace, but it must have been difficult for her to adjust to the new situation that required her to wait for a greeting. The young lady looked at them intently and listened to everything very carefully. The Baroness said that the first step in learning etiquette was repetition. Proper behavior should become second nature to her. The Baroness said that she had heard about Madame's situation. She was surprised and wondered if she hadn't even taught her the basics. The Empress hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Elier looked at the Baroness intently and said that Madame had never said anything like that and had never greeted her first. Madame froze in shock on the spot. The Empress, in turn, now understood perfectly well that Madame had really looked down on her. The Baroness approached the young lady and said that she remembered having mentioned Madame's rude behavior. She asked the lady if the Empress was now telling the truth. The lady said that she had only been present once and could not say for sure. The Baroness froze in shock and said that it seemed that Madame had lost her mind. The Empress was in shock and wondered if everything was really that serious and bad. The Baroness asked the Empress for forgiveness, as she should not have spoken rudely about the Kanto in her presence. The Empress smiled and said that it was all right, as her words made her feel better. The lady looked closely at Bernice and said that it was the first time she had seen her so angry. The Baroness said that she had always been sure that Madame knew etiquette perfectly well. She breathed a sigh of relief and said that it was very good that they quickly realized how cruelly she was deceiving them. She looked closely at the Empress and said that various celebrations and meetings are held in the palace, and all sorts of people appear in the palace. Ambassadors often come who wish to acquire negotiations. She said that aristocrats also come to the palace. They come from other countries during holidays, for example, the emperor's birthday. And on such a day, there are many people in the palace. She looked closely at the Empress and said that in time she would begin to attract attention at such celebrations. She said that the Empress had been devoting herself to studying at the academy before she took the position of Empress, and for this reason, guests would be looking at her, which would cause inconvenience. The Baroness told the Empress that she absolutely must familiarize herself with imperial etiquette. It was necessary when communicating with foreign guests. The basics alone would not be enough. Elier looked at her intently and said that she had a question. She asked Madame if it would be rude if she revealed the fact that it was she who taught her etiquette, not Madame. She said that if she simply refused lessons from a man renowned for his knowledge, the old aristocrats might be displeased. The Empress sighed heavily and said that she simply could not believe that she would have to waste time on useless activities. The Baroness said that they would not be completely useless. The Baroness smiled and said that Madame would certainly give her some good advice to confuse her, and she would have an excellent chance to punish the fools and proud people who wanted to do the same as Madame did. The Baroness looked intently at the Empress and said with a grin that she would teach her how to respond to those who were rude to her. The knight looked intently at the Emperor and asked if he was listening to him, as he had very important news. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that he asked not to bother him with trifles. He said that he just wanted to report. The Emperor sighed heavily and told the knight that in that case he should have gone through the door. He stopped and told the Emperor that he himself had asked to immediately report everything that happened to the Empress, and the door was far away. He said that the Baroness and the Empress had met secretly today. He said that the woman had a very good reputation and an impeccable past, and she used to teach etiquette to the Empress's assistant. Nothing else connected them. The Emperor looked at the knight in surprise and asked if there was nothing more he could say. The knight asked if the Emperor wanted to know about the crazy madam. He said that the Baroness would take care of the Empress's education, so there was no need to worry. He said that you and Madame's family have had a suspicious amount of money lately, and that it is probably connected to a rat who is embezzling tax revenue. The Emperor thought about it and wondered whether he should kill her. The young lady informed the Empress that the invited aristocrats had arrived in their carriages, and the Empress wondered if the guests were all arriving at the same time. The lady smiled and said that everything was going well thanks to the Baroness's advice. Everyone was happy. She said that they should also come out in a few minutes to the guests. The lady smiled and said that she asked the headmaid, and she said that all the guests had arrived. The Empress thanked the young lady for her work. Elier looked at the lady closely and said with a smile that she knew she had a hard time. The maid looked at the Empress and said that she should get up so she could change her dress. The Empress smiled and said that she wanted to have a tea party in honor of her reign. She was furious, and since Madame had managed to organize everything herself, she couldn't even cancel the meeting because Madame had already spread the news throughout the empire. She was furious because she had to learn bad etiquette, and now she had to completely retrain. Jaren looked at the Empress intently and said that if she didn't speed up, the work would continue to pile up. He didn't understand how one could have a tea party at such a time. She was furious because her own assistant scolded her, even though she didn't organize all this. The young lady looked closely at the Empress and said that the assistant had not said anything like that. He didn't say anything like that when she took the documents. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was not helping with Her Majesty's schedule today. The young lady looked at the secretary and said that the Empress asked him to bring documents that she could approve of his free time. He sighed heavily as he did not understand why she needed a tea ceremony right now. She looked at him intently and said that of course they had a lot of work to do. After all, the Empress had not been in the palace for a long time. She said that even poor aristocrats arranged such meetings, and they would still have to organize a tea party. He looked at her intently and asked if there was any benefit in such amusements. He said that the nobility using their position to avoid working, and they talk only about jewelry and clothes. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he thought very highly of her, as she was more interested in working for the good of the country than in drinking tea and spending money. The Empress looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was okay. Since her eyes were glassy, the Empress asked if something was wrong. Murin looked at the Empress intently and said that everything was fine. The Empress told the young lady that she did not have to attend the tea party with her at all and could go and rest. The young lady told the Empress that everything was fine, and the Baroness asked her to accompany the Empress. She looked at the Empress intently and told her to remember that only she could give orders in the palace. Elir, in turn, decided that she would try her best when she took her wedding vows. She knew she didn't care if people thought she was stupid and uninterested in power, but when someone interfered with her duties, she had no choice but to resist. She knew that she must not show her timidity, for people might be high-ranking aristocrats, but they were still servants of the empire. The Empress thought for a moment, since everything happened as the Baroness said. The Baroness told the Empress with a smile that all the ladies at the meeting were noble but not very famous. She knew that even if an aristocrat was not interested in politics, he had to maintain relationships in social circles. If they quarreled with someone powerful, then they could forget about a successful marriage for their children. She understood perfectly well that the most important guest at the tea party would be Madame. She understood perfectly well that all the ladies would decide that it was better to listen to Madame than to the new Empress. The Baroness told her that all the ladies would expect her to be the first to disgrace herself. She knew that it would not be easy for her in this situation, but she also knew that she had to show whom they were obliged to obey. She knew that the Empress does not bow her head unless the Emperor is before her. Elir looked at her maid and said that she was sure that all the invited were here. Murin said that it was correct. The Empress said that everything looked very strange, and she had high hopes for the ladies whom Madame herself had invited. She looked intently at Madame and those present, and said that it seemed that they were all speechless. Madame looked in surprise at the Empress and said that it was very rude to the guests. The Empress looked at Madame in surprise and asked if she really thought she was rude. She looked at the people present and asked Madame if she had not taught the girls etiquette. She said that it was very rude to stand like a silent doll when the Empress was nearby. Elie looked at Madame and said that she was keeping her distance so as not to ruin her reputation. Madame was furious as she did not expect this. She looked at the Empress intently, for she knew that she was behaving very impudently. She wondered if the Empress got along very well with the Emperor. She said that she understood very well that there had been no Empress in the palace for a long time, but she could not believe that they had completely forgotten their manners. She looked at those present and said that the noble ladies would greet the Empress during the debut. She said that the Empress herself also approves of marriages between representatives of the sign. The Empress said with a grin that at such tea parties, they usually discuss marriages and the latest news. She said she wanted to touch on a few topics, but she wasn't really enjoying their meeting right now. She looked at those present and said that everyone knew that they were insulting the imperial family with their actions, but they continued. She said that punishing them according to the law would be very troublesome, and she will turn a blind eye to their rudeness. She said that if this happens again, they themselves must understand what will happen, that they will certainly approach this case with all due care. Elir looked at her assistant and said that they should go as they had a lot to do, and the secretary was probably very angry. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she hoped that was not the case. All the ladies were worried and didn't know what to do now. They looked at Madame and said that she said that nothing would happen, but it was a complete disaster. They were worried about what would happen to their daughters. Madame was furious and did not understand how the Empress dared to humiliate her. She knew that the Empress knew nothing about etiquette and the imperial palace. Jaren sighed heavily, as there were a lot of documents. He said that it was very good to be an aristocrat, as you can turn a blind eye to theft from the treasury and enjoy life. A moment later, he picked up the papers and saw a report from the family Madame Johann. He thought they had nothing to do with the Minister of Finance. He had seen many false documents, and they were all the same. He knew that such a document would require re-examination. He remembered the young lady asking why he didn't like the Empress. Murin looked at him intently and said that he had been performing the duties of the Empress even before the Empress herself appeared. She was puzzled and did not understand why he was so cold towards her. He knew that the Empress's face made him angry, and he needed to take a walk to clear his head. He didn't care at all that she was the second person in the empire. He wrote a note on the documents and left the office. He sighed heavily, as the Empress had only made his situation worse. He was not just cold, it was a terrible feeling. The Empress has ruined her first tea ceremony, and by tomorrow, it will be in all the newspapers. The young lady knew that Madame's actions had played into her hands, and now she could fire her. She knew that no one cared what people thought, and she just had to do her job. She was puzzled, because no matter what she did, the numbers did not add up. She thought it was very strange. The Emperor looked closely at the Empress and said that he found it even stranger that she was taking work into the bedroom. She asked her husband for forgiveness, as she did not want to be distracted. Rofers looked at her and said that the empire would be in perfect order if she didn't spend one night working. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was true. She sighed heavily and said that one document was really bothering her. He looked at her intently and asked which document. She hesitated and said that it was her job and she would figure it out herself. She said that he probably didn't want to discuss business now. He looked at her intently and asked if she was happy with everything. The young lady apologized and asked what he was talking about. He said that he knew that they had made this decision together, but since the day she moved into the palace, she had been working constantly. He said that unfortunately, her freedom was limited. He asked if she was happy with this life. The young lady looked at the Emperor in surprise as she saw that he was more than serious. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Looking at her husband, she asked whether the Emperor or her husband was asking her the question. Rofers looked at the young lady intently. A moment later, he asked if it made any difference. She smiled and said that, of course, that changed everything completely, and she had to know in what person he was asking. The young lady said with a smile that if he was asking on behalf of her husband, it meant he was worried about her. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if they should get to know each other better that evening. He sighed heavily and said that she should know that he had no interests. He said that his entire childhood was connected with war and massacre. She sighed heavily, since this was not what she wanted to talk about. He looked at her intently and said that on his return, he had to clear the courtyard of dissenting aristocrats. She looked at him intently and said that today he could ask her any questions. He looked at her in surprise. She smiled and said that he could ask whatever he wanted. The Emperor thought for a moment and asked her when she realized that she was smarter than anyone else. She said that right at the moment of birth, she already knew that she was different. He sighed heavily and said that he understood her. She smiled and said that it was a joke, and she could not remember something from infancy. She thought for a moment and said that she simply always asked for books that were difficult for her age, and her parents bought them. She understood that knowledge in various fields would be useful in high society. One day, her teacher sent her answers to the academy. She didn't know what potential he saw in her, but she got permission to go to the academy and was happy because she could learn a lot in the academies here. She sighed heavily and said that her only mistake was agreeing to the engagement with that idiot. He looked at the young lady intently, deep in thought. The knight looked at the Emperor and said that everyone was convinced that he and the Empress were on good terms. He looked at the knight and said that he could keep the rumors to himself. Jonathan said that he was obliged to tell him everything he asked the Emperor if he did not think that he was now acting a little cruel, since he was running around the palace with different errands, and they were very strange. While his partner relaxed, he stood at his post and guarded the Empress. He looked at the Emperor intently and asked with a smile if he would give the Empress anything. He said that she did not seem to be very interested in valuables. He looked closely at the Emperor and said that even though they had just married, they should not forget about gifts. The Emperor wondered what kind of gift the Empress would like. Jonathan looked at the Emperor with puzzlement and said that he should know this better than anyone since they communicate. He knew that everyone loved gifts, but he was puzzled and did not know what his wife loved. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked if her story had really tired him out. The Emperor was taken aback and said that everything was not so simple. He was thinking about what he wanted to ask her. She smiled and said that absolutely any question would do. He said that she seemed to have interests in many things. He asked me if she found the monotonous work in the palace boring. She smiled and said that it was a very interesting question. She asked if that was the reason he asked her if everything was okay with her. Elier Wu smiled and said that she had not worked in this field before, but she had to do a lot of counting, so she was interested. She said that people usually study to apply their knowledge in their work. He smiled and asked what kind of reward she wanted. She looked at him in surprise and asked if the Empress paid for performing duties. His hint flew past her with a whistle. He smiled and said that she might think again, since she might get something other than money. For example, jewelry. She sighed heavily and said that she already had a lot of jewelry that she did not wear. He asked if she wanted a new outfit. She said that she had never had so many clothes in her life as she did now. She asked anxiously what was going on, because she saw that he wanted to give her something. She looked at him intently and in surprise. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to be presumptuous. She asked her husband if he really wanted to give her a gift. The emperor, in turn, looked away from her. But a moment later, looking at his wife, he said that it was exactly like that. The young lady, in turn, was shocked because she saw that her husband was very nice. She thought that she had already gotten used to his face, but she was wrong. She wondered if he really wanted to give her something. He said that she was an empress, and therefore he could give her everything. She looked away from him in embarrassment, as she could not stand this any longer. She timidly asked if she could ask him a question. She wanted to ask him something. He looked at her intently and said he was listening. She came closer to him and hugged him. She asked if he had forgotten that they were trying to court each other. The lady asked her husband for forgiveness if he was uncomfortable. She said that she was just very happy. She knew that, as an empress, she had no right to do so according to etiquette, but she believed that people in relationships should be honest with each other. He asked in surprise if she was really happy. She smiled and said that everything was exactly like that. She smiled and said that if he wanted to give her a gift, he could choose a book for her. She said that he probably felt awkward, but still asked for forgiveness. He smiled and said that everything was fine. He reached out to her, but quickly pulled his hand away. He said with a smile that she could hug him whenever she wanted. She still believed that there was nothing more powerful than cuteness, and because of this, she wondered if people really wanted to court someone so much and then become a family. She knew it was a little unfair that her husband was not only handsome in appearance, but also had a rather gentle character. She knew she shouldn't worry about always waking up. He only had that temperament once. When she woke up, she decided to take a little walk and noticed that the emperor's room was larger than hers. She didn't understand why it needed such dimensions if he slept alone. She knew he would be more comfortable sharing space with someone. A moment later, she noticed her papers. She noticed a note that they needed to be reviewed. She looked closely at the papers and thought for a moment. The emperor left her a note in which he wrote that she should keep a close eye on her secretary. She thought for a moment, not knowing what that meant, since he had put it on her himself. Elier wondered if that was why he hated her so much. She knew he was a bit of a grumbler, but he got the job done. She noticed she hadn't brought the documents and wondered if the emperor had left his. She saw documents about diplomacy and became interested. A moment later, the maids knocked on her door and asked permission to enter. They looked closely at the young lady and asked if it was okay to eat stripes. The maid smiled and said mistress that she had brought her an outfit. Elier asked in surprise where Janet was. She said that the maid cleaned her office, and then the secretary came and sent her to the Ministry of Finance. The Empress was surprised she did not understand who allowed him to order her maids around. The young lady smiled and said that she ran into the emperor when she came to the palace. Morin Wu smiled and said that the emperor told her that the Empress was here, and she was very happy. Elier looked closely at her assistant and asked if she saw the documents on the table. The Empress told her that she had previously done paperwork and probably knew how documents were processed at the Ministry of Finance. She asked the assistant if she could look at them and say something. She said that looking at these papers was not their job. She sighed heavily and said that it was very strange, and perhaps one of the documents was a sample. The Empress asked her in surprise what she was talking about. The Empress asked her assistant if the seals were really different there. Murin hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She said that the seal is different from the official seal of the empire. She said that hundreds of documents come to the palace every day. Each department must do its part. and their work is mainly related to the internal affairs of the palace. She said that some might say it was easy, but the celebrations were expensive, so the Empress's approval was required. Looking at the Empress, she said that some documents should receive seals under special circumstances. She said that the stamp is needed if the amount requested exceeds the budget allocated from the department, or something happens that requires more money from the cash register than expected. The Empress sighed heavily and said that they needed to be careful because the Empress's assistant had access to the documents. The lady said she had heard that departments sometimes received papers with stamps on them just in case, but that rarely happened. The Empress said that if the minister had the ability to put seals, then he could approve any documents. She said that she heard that only the head of the ministry could put the seal, and now this place belongs to a member of the Fezzel family. She sighed heavily and said that this meant that the man was capable of forging the necessary documents. The Empress looked at her assistant and asked if she could take her to the ministry, and she would personally find out everything. The lady said that she could go alone. The Empress said that the documents they had just shown were very strange, and they came from the ministry, and her assistant handed the documents over to her for approval. The young lady looked at the Empress in surprise and bewilderment, and asked what she was talking about. Murin knew the man, and didn't think that he could steal something or forge documents. They walked slowly to the Ministry of Finance and talked about this topic. Elier was furious because she thought the finance minister seemed to be underestimating her. Maril was shocked by the amount of money they were asking for to entertain the guests. The Empress froze in place when she saw the maids. The maid looked at her friends and said that it was time for her to get back to work. Elier and Murin Z froze in place in shock. She looked closely at her maid and screamed. The maid was taken aback as she saw the Empress. Murin P ran up to the maid and excitedly asked what happened. The maid sighed heavily and said that she had just fallen. The lady looked at the maid and said that this could not be, and that someone had hit her. She smiled and said that she was fine and would soon heal. The Empress, in turn, understood perfectly well that people were saying all sorts of things about her, and she constantly ignored them. She looked intently at her maid. The maid looked intently at the Empress and asked for forgiveness for her inappropriate appearance. Bowing, she told the Empress that she would accept any punishment. The Empress, in turn, did not want to play a stupid struggle for power. She was simply interested in her work, and now someone has suffered because of her reputation. The Empress looked closely at her maid and said that she had not told her to take the blows for her. She looked intently at the young maid and told her to immediately tell who had raised a hand against her. She looked intently at the maid and said that she would severely punish her offender. The Empress looked at her assistant and said that they would put aside all their business and should take care of the maid. Murin looked at the Empress and said that she would take the maid to the next building where the doctor was. Jonathan sighed heavily, for he knew that all had been peaceful when Balta had stood guard. He knew that the Emperor was in a good mood and did not know how to tell him that the Empress was furious. The maid knew that she should just quickly deliver the documents and then immediately return to the Empress. She walked and thought about how to best style the Empress's hair today, but a moment later, she heard a conversation. From the conversation, she understood that they were talking about the Empress. Madame said that the Empress needed to be taught a good lesson so that she would remember it for the rest of her life. Madame said that they should wait a little since the Empress had not put her in the best light, and she would do everything to ensure that the village girl would be disgraced at the banquet. The maid froze in shock. After examining the young lady, the doctor said that she had been hit in the face repeatedly. The Empress looked intently at the doctor and asked what they had beaten her servant with. The lady sighed heavily and said that perhaps these marks were from a ring. The doctor sighed heavily and said that sometimes angry aristocrats really did beat their maids. The Empress sighed heavily and said that this meant that both palaces had a lady who did not know that the young lady was her maid. She thought for a moment and said that it was most likely the lady who did not want to respect her. Madame looked at the maid intently and asked how she dared to eavesdrop. Madame said she knew her, and she was one of the Empress's maids, and it seemed she had fallen under the bad influence of her mistress. The maid, trembling with fear, said that she had only heard Madame mention the Empress. Madame told the maid that she had probably forgotten her position there. Madame looked at the maid with fury and said that, so that she would not see or hear, she should simply silently carry out her duties and nothing more. The madam angrily slapped the maid in the face and said that even though she was the Empress's maid, she could easily get rid of her. The maid looked at her friend and asked if she was okay. Katie looked at her intently and said that the Empress told her to rest. She said that she would clean everything up herself. Janet sighed heavily and said that she thought she deserved to be punished, and that Madame was right, but she was still confused by the Empress's words. The Empress looked closely at the maid and told her not to work today, but rather to rest in her room. The Empress asked the maid if her face still hurt. The maid, puzzled, said that the imperial doctor had helped and that she was fine. The Empress looked at the maid intently and said that she should not cry anymore, and she promised that that evil woman would get what she deserved. The maid was surprised, for Her Majesty said that Madame had done wrong, and the Empress was very angry when she suffered. The maid looked at her friend and said that she was complaining about her to the Empress. Janet said with a smile that she would not be upset if the Empress scolded her. Jonathan sighed heavily. He didn't like it when the atmosphere became like this. He looked closely at the Empress as he saw that she was angrier than before. He did not know what had happened. The Empress looked closely at her husband and said that she wanted to dismiss Madame. She asked the Emperor if he had any objections. He looked at her intently and said that the Empress could make such decisions herself. She looked at him intently and said that she understood everything, but she had only recently become Empress, and Madame, unfortunately, was very famous among the old aristocrats. She asked if they would be angry if she fired her. He looked at her intently and said calmly that simply getting rid of all the dissatisfied Elier said that she would then become an Empress, using the power of the Emperor to get rid of dissenters. She looked at her husband closely and said she wished they had a reason to fire him. Madame Jonathan was shocked as the tension could be cut with a knife. The Empress told her husband that she had reviewed the documents at his request and noticed that they had been tampered with at the Ministry of Finance. She said that the secretary had asked her maid to take the papers there. She said that she had spent less money on the reception than was indicated in the documents and the last big file of the investigation. She found out that the funds were appropriated by the Facile K family, which is connected with Madame. She looked at the Emperor intently and said, "This is a very serious crime, and they cannot just let it go, madam." She hoped that her words would have an effect on her husband. Jonathan looked at those present and asked for forgiveness. He said that he wanted to say something regarding Madame and the Marquise. The Emperor looked at the knight intently and said that he had asked him to remain silent. He asked for forgiveness, but said that the Empress must know. She looked at them intently and said that he could tell her everything. Jonathan looked at the Empress and said that the Emperor already knew about the violation of the law. He said that today, the Marquise's estate will host a secret meeting of the nobility, and that place is already surrounded by knights. He said that the secretary who allowed the false documents to get to her will be punished later, Madame. The young lady froze in place when she heard about her secretary. A moment later, she froze in place and wondered why she was angry in the first place and why she had come to the Emperor. She remembered that she was very irritated by the behavior of Madame, and then she hit her maid. And she also found out that Madame was stealing large sums of money from the treasury. She was puzzled because she only wanted to punish her according to the law. She thought that she had dealt with everything herself, but all this time, the Emperor knew about everything. The Empress looked intently at those present and asked if they could go out for a long time and leave her alone with the Emperor. She looked at them intently and said that she needed to speak to the Emperor personally. She was furious because she realized that he knew about everything. She looked at the Emperor closely and said that she had heard something about the Facile D family about their wedding. She said that since there were witnesses, she was sure that the story about him killing the worker was true. She looked at him intently and said that she also knew that the employee of the Ministry of Finance belonged to the Facile family, that he had gotten rid of someone from the Marquise family, and that was why he had decided to look after this house. Elier said that he also had to know that Madame was in cahoots with them. She sighed heavily and said that she had no comrades in the palace, only maids and assistants. The Empress said that Madame had tyrannized over her maid, so she promised to punish the offender. She said that she was sure that he would grant her request. She looked closely at her husband and said that it seemed like he already knew everything. She sighed heavily and said that he had heard about her abilities, so he agreed to the marriage. Elier sighed heavily and said that it seemed he had not expected anything from her in the role of Empress. She screamed angrily and asked if he had never thought of her as a political partner. She in turn wondered if she had expected too much from him. Within a couple of hours, they seemed to have become strangers again. She was puzzled because she knew that everything had gone fine the previous night. She looked closely at her husband and wondered if he was no longer interested in her. She looked at him intently and called out. She said that last night he asked what gift she wanted. She asked if he really didn't want to talk to her anymore, and Refers sighed and said that that wasn't the issue. He said he thought any excuse he made would make her angry. She sighed heavily and said that they were angry with him. She was just very disappointed. She said that he himself wanted to avoid unnecessary conflicts and promised never to quarrel. She sighed heavily and said that this is exactly what they were doing now. Elier looked at her husband closely and said that she was smart and he was strong, but they were both terribly stupid when it came to their relationship. She said that on the first day of their marriage, they agreed to get along, even went for a walk to spend time together. She knew that if they didn't talk about important things, they couldn't be a couple. He sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry, as it was his fault. She was shocked that he apologized so quickly. He looked at her and said that he remembered exactly what was said that day. He said that any quarrel between them was his fault and that he had just upset her. She looked at him intently and said that he had a chance to tell her what was happening, but he chose to remain silent. She said that of course this would lead to misunderstandings. The emperor said that anyone who caused trouble in the palace should be executed, and he had no intention of dragging her into violence. She knew that his words did not make her feel relieved. He sighed heavily and said sadly that he was very sorry. She wondered how much longer he would apologize, as this was very strange. She asked in surprise if he was really that ashamed. She said he shouldn't forget his status. He said he promised to apologize if he made a mistake. Elier said she felt uncomfortable hearing so many requests for forgiveness. She looked at him hard and asked if he remembered last night. She said she was still mad at him, but they had to make peace somehow. She looked at him hard and said that from now on, this was what they had to do when they felt guilty. She looked closely at her husband and wondered why he acted so insecure at such moments. She looked at him intently and asked what he was waiting for. Elier said that he should hug her and make peace with her. She asked him what he thought about it and whether he agreed to do it, or whether he felt uncomfortable. He looked at his wife with embarrassment and said that he liked it. He asked, puzzled, if he could touch her. She sighed heavily and said that of course he could, since they were married. She said he could hold her tighter and she wouldn't break. He sighed heavily and said they would leave it at that for now. Rofers looked hard at his wife and said they should get back to talking. She asked her husband how long he had known about the forged documents and the theft of money. He said that he had known about everything for some time, but had only recently found the culprit. Elier asked him if there was a special reason why he was Madam's nanny as her teacher. He said that he simply invited Madam because he had heard of her reputation. Elier looked at him and said that she really hoped that he had handed over some government affairs to her because of his faith in her abilities, but she still needed the support of assistants. She said that his secretary had worked hard to become his assistant, and he could understand his resentment. She said that didn't mean he could be allowed to do such things. She asked if he had worked honestly. He thought festeringly about the fact that the Empress was not there yet, and wondered whether he could not get away with just being deprived of his position. The Emperor said that he gave his assistant to her because he believed that he would be faithful to her to the end, and even before their wedding, he wanted to make him her assistant. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that he thought the young man would support her in any timeline. He sighed heavily and said that he never thought he would do something like that. She was puzzled and surprised because she did not understand why he trusted the man so much and believed that he would be faithful to her here. She would like to ask more questions to clarify everything Elier knew, that her husband never ignored her. She knew that he could make all the decisions without taking into account the opinion of the Empress. She understood perfectly well that if he were a real tyrant, he would have killed her long ago. Looking at him, she trusted him completely. She knew that they could talk about feelings later, but now it was more important to catch the criminal who stole from the treasury. Murin looked at Jonathan closely and asked if he was one of the Emperor's personal guards. She said that he often avoided other people's eyes, so they could not talk before. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that he did not understand what she was talking about. Murin said that she saw him carefully questioning the maids near the Empress's office, and perhaps he was keeping an eye on them. He smiled, and looking at the lady, said that she was very observant. She smiled and said that he seemed to wish the Empress no harm, so she remained silent. She looked at him and asked if he was married or in love. He smiled and asked if she was interested. The lady said that if he was going to joke, the conversation was over. She asked him what he would do if his beloved wanted to work for the good of the empire. He said that he received a good salary and would not like to see his beloved in need, but still he would support her if she wanted it. He smiled and said that it would still be nice to meet by chance in the palace sometimes. The young lady smiled and said that this was a very funny answer. He looked at her intently and said that he was not joking. He did not understand why she found it so funny. She smiled and said that it was nice to hear such a stunning statement from an imperial knight. She said that the secretary was raised by a commoner because his opinion was different. She didn't want to speak rudely about him because of his status. She looked at him intently and said that he should be glad that he had not yet met a truly talented lady. She looked at him intently and said that for some time there was only one woman working with government documents. She said that it was the Empress, and now she is here too. She looked at the knight closely and asked if he thought it was unfair. She said that the Emperor said he would hire people based on their abilities, not status, so she got a good job. She looked at him intently and asked if he knew what it was like to live in a society where women were not allowed to advance in their careers. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was taking her anger out on him since she could do nothing with the secretary. He asked if he should really inform the Emperor about her hot temper. Murin said that he had been trying to get information out of her from the very beginning. She smiled and said that she was not against it, but she was sure that he and the other knights were just doing their job. She asked if they would catch all the criminals during the evening ambush. He said that they probably would, but he was ordered to stay in the palace, so he was not privy to the fighting. She looked at him sharply and said that perhaps he was not doing a very good job. After all, Jonathan asked furiously what that was supposed to mean. He shouted that he served directly to the Emperor. He looked at the lady intently and said that he was still a strong knight. The lady looked at Madame and said with a smile that she had no need to be angry. Since the Empress was just a young and naive girl who had done nothing, Madame sighed heavily and said that it would be wonderful if she were a village simpleton. Madame was furious and did not understand where the Empress learned to speak like that. The man looked intently at the madam and said with a smile that in the entire empire only she could teach the Empress etiquette. The man said that from now on she would play a more important role in their plans. He asked if she knew the rumors that were going around the palace. Madame asked if he was really talking about those funny stories now. She heard someone say that the new Empress had bewitched the tyrant. She smiled and said that she could hardly believe it, but the maids were convinced that they had seen the Empress leaving the Emperor's room. The man looked at the lady and said that the Emperor had killed his elder brother, and for this reason he thought that the Emperor had revealed them. However, the Emperor had made him finance minister, and he would have killed him if he had known about the documents. He said that the old aristocracy still obeyed the palace, but they needed to take control of the Emperor and Empress Balta. Fee sighed and said that now he understood why the Emperor chose him, since Jonathan would not have held back and finished everyone off. The lady was taken aback as she heard someone scream. She froze in place. The man looked into the distance in surprise, because he did not understand who was shouting. He ordered the servants to find the person immediately. Balta came closer to them and said angrily that their little celebration had started late. He said that they had made him wait a long time. He looked closely at those present and said that everyone had things to do. He did not understand where the temporary entertainment came from. He looked at everyone present with anger and said that since they were all already drunk, there was no point in hiding. He said that he had been allowed to get rid of them, but the situation had changed. He looked intently at the Marquis and Madame and said that the Emperor wished to speak with them. He looked at those present and said with disdain that death at the hands of the Emperor was a great honor. He said with fury that they must follow him. The man was excited, because no one knew anything, but everyone was invited to the palace unexpectedly. He noticed that there were many old and new aristocrats in the palace, but there were also those who remained neutral. He was surprised, because women were also invited. He thought that this was not a meeting of heads of houses, although most of those present had influence in high society. A moment later, the knight announced that the emperor and empress had arrived. The knight told everyone present that they should bow their heads and greet them. Everyone whispered as if they did not understand what was happening. The empress looked at everyone present with rage, as the third was stealing money from the treasury. The emperor looked at those present and said that it seemed that almost everyone had come. He asked everyone if they knew why he had gathered them at such a late hour. No one answered. The emperor looked at those present with a grin and said that it seemed his question was too difficult for them. He said that they found out that many of the employees of the Ministry of Finance were kings from the treasury and handed over money to the aristocrats. He said that without the empress, he could not keep track of the internal affairs of the empire. He said that it seemed that emperors got married for this very reason. The emperor looked at his knight and said that it seemed that the suspects were also already present in the hall. Balta P knelt before the emperor and said that he had brought criminals. The emperor looked at Madame ye Marquise with disdain. Everyone present was shocked, as they did not expect that they would dare to steal after what happened. The emperor looked at the Marquis and said that everyone knew that he was the younger brother of the Baron, whom he had executed in the spring. He said that the Baron had committed a similar crime, but he still allowed the Marquis to become a minister since his family did an excellent job. He looked at the man intently and said that he did not think that he would be more stupid than his brother. After all, he had even granted him the title of Marquis. He looked at him intently and asked if he had been present at his brother's execution. The emperor looked intently at all those present, and in a calm manner said that he knew all their secrets. The emperor looked at Madame with fury and said that he remembered that she had convinced him that she had an excellent command of etiquette and would be able to help the empress. He said that he was also informed that she had said unflattering things at the ceremony. She had called the empress a country bumpkin who had bewitched the emperor. He had looked at her with disdain and said that she wanted to control them. Everyone present was shocked, because they did not believe that Madame would say such a thing. They had previously heard that she was bragging about her new purchases. They could not believe that she would do such a thing. The Empress, in turn, noticed that everyone was trying to shift the blame onto each other. She was puzzled and did not know how long this comedy would last. The madam said that she was not going to die alone, since all those present were also guilty, and no one refused expensive gifts. The emperor looked at her with a grin and asked if she was ready to name her accomplices. He smiled and said that he would like to propose to her, as she said he was a tyrant. He wondered why he would bring them alive. The empress looked at her husband in surprise. He looked at the culprits with fury and said that he even gathered their friends, but they continued to pretend. He looked at those present and said that because of their friends, they were the only ones dying. He said that they had to be fair, because everyone deserved to be punished. He said that he knew many of their comrades, but he might have missed a couple of names. He looked at them intently and said that they must now name them. The emperor looked at the guilty with a grin and said that he would reduce the sentence for each name. Murin looked closely at the empress and asked if she was okay. Elier looked at her assistant in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Murin said that perhaps she had no right to interfere, but as the emperor had said, those who dared to steal from the treasury, given the seriousness of the crime, could be executed. She knew it was the right thing to do, but she felt bad about the situation. The man said that of course he attended these events, but it never occurred to him that they were organizing them with stolen money. Madame was furious and said that he was lying since he knew everything, since he proposed to replace the current empress. The emperor said he found it funny to hear this, as he thought he had dealt with most of the rats. The emperor looked at those present and said that after returning from the war, he had gotten rid of several noble families. He asked if this was not a fitting warning to the others. He looked at those present intently and said that he would make a decision, but now they all needed to leave. The lady looked at the empress and said that his life depended on her decree, and he could even die. She looked closely at the empress and timidly said that she was sure she would make a wise decision. She told the empress that she must remember that she must not sympathize with him, The Empress looked closely at the secretary and said that he was very calm for someone who was about to be punished. He sighed heavily and said that he had already been transferred to a worse job, and there were no opportunities left in the palace anyway. Although his unpleasant situation could hardly upset her, she looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really so disgusted by working with the Empress and not with the Emperor. He looked at the young lady and said that the Empire accepts people regardless of their status, but commoners still do not receive a proper education. He sighed heavily and said that it was difficult for him even to read to learn, and he had to fight for a long time for his position. He asked if she knew what reward he received for his efforts. Everyone said that they were very sorry that he was not an aristocrat. He sighed heavily and said that, of course, it did not bother him, because he could serve as an assistant to the emperor and decide state affairs. She looked at him intently and said that she also received some state assignments. The empress said that she learned that he was previously responsible for them, but he was made her assistant. She said that she knew perfectly well that these matters were very important and did not want to deprive him of the right to deal with them. However, she looked through the documents and came to the conclusion that she was more suitable for this work. And if his knowledge in the field of construction was deeper, she would have informed the emperor. He looked at her hard and said that she had received the best education because of her noble birth. She looked at him hard and said that his personal misfortunes had nothing to do with his work. The Empress asked him if he really thought that his mind was comparable to her if he was born into a rich family. She said that the system of governance of the empire and all its laws were created by a sage, and sages are those who are recognized as masters in 3 or more disciplines, and it is necessary to put forward and substantiate several new theories. She said she presented her third theory and received the title at 20. She said that she was the third young scientist to receive a place in the Hall of Fame. Although no one knew about it, Jonathan thought that she was smarter than the emperor. She looked at the secretary intently and said that she was making every effort to work on time, but he was deliberately interfering and committing serious crimes. She said that perhaps in the future he could get a more important job. She said that he had no need to be angry with others because of his mistakes. He sighed heavily and asked for execution for himself, and perhaps in the next life he would be an aristocrat. She looked at her secretary and said that there would be no execution. She said that he must leave the capital and must see how they would move forward without him. She looked at him intently and said that he would see what she had done and then regret the missed opportunity. The young lady looked at him intently and said that his title and treasures would be taken away, and he himself would be banished from the capital. He was forbidden to appear in the capital for the rest of his life. She looked at him closely and said that he didn't need to run away right away, since they let him pack his things. He sighed heavily and said that she seemed very pleased. She smiled and said she couldn't deny it. She said she just found it amusing that a person could screw up his life that much. Jonathan looked at the young lady with a smile on his face as he noticed that she was angry. She looked at him intently and said that he had told the Empress that status was not important, but that was just plain pity. She said that since they decided to spare him, he should take a closer look at the world. He will see many different types of injustice. He said he wouldn't have time to examine her because he wasn't an aristocrat like her. She said he was now comparing her to those ladies he had spoken so cruelly of. She knew that for those who insulted the imperial family, there was only the death penalty. She knew that she should have taken his life, but she could not. She understood perfectly well that one day she would still have to take someone's life. The maid looked at the Empress in surprise and asked if they were finished yet, since they had seen many aristocrats recently. The young lady froze in place as she realized that she had returned to her palace. She looked at her maid in surprise and asked why she was not resting. Katie S. said that the maid wanted to prepare her for bed. The young lady slowly approached the maid and said that there was no need for that, and that she should take care of herself. The maid smiled and asked how she could fall asleep, knowing that the Empress was still working. She smiled and said she didn't think she could sleep until he helped her with the preparations. The young lady thought for a moment. She remembered the words of her mother, Madame, telling her that the palace would become her home. She sighed heavily and said that she would certainly do everything to become a worthy empress. The emperor looked at the knight in surprise and asked if his wife had really said that she wanted to expel him from the capital. The knight sighed heavily and said that usually people did not like to take the lives of others, and besides, punishing the Empress made sense. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that it was unlikely that anything serious would happen in the future. He told the knight to forget about the man, as the Empress might be interested in his condition. Jonathan said that he had to watch him until he ran away, and he even watched the Empress when she returned to her place. He said that he was not against such work, but still he said that it seemed to him that the Emperor liked Baltimore. He sighed heavily and said that they were equal in his eyes. Jonathan said that his friend was getting all the interesting assignments. The Emperor looked at him and told him to stop grumbling because he wouldn't be sleeping today either. The Emperor looked closely at the bunks and the Tsar and said that they had not taken out all the garbage. Jonathan said he would take care of everything properly. He smiled and said that the Empress tried very hard for the sake of her servants, and they could not do otherwise. Reading the newspaper, the man was indignant, as he knew that the aristocrats were already rich, but still they dared to steal their taxes. His friend said that the Emperor executed them anyway, and they got what they deserved. The woman looked at her friend and said that her niece worked in the palace, and she said that the Empress was the first to notice something was wrong. As he passed people, he heard everyone he knew how everything really was. He wondered if she would be just as arrogant the next time they met. The Emperor looked at the Marquis and said that everyone knew that he was the younger brother of the Baron, whom he had executed in the spring. He said that the Baron had committed a similar crime, but he still allowed the Marquis to become a minister since his family did an excellent job. He looked at the man intently and said that he did not think that he would be more stupid than his brother. After all, he had even granted him the title of Marquis. He looked at him intently and asked if he had been present at his brother's execution. The Emperor looked intently at all those present, and in a calm manner said that he knew all their secrets. The Emperor looked at Madame with fury and said that he remembered that she had convinced him that she had an excellent command of etiquette and would be able to help the Empress. He said that he was also informed that she had said unflattering things at the ceremony. She had called the Empress a country bumpkin who had bewitched the Emperor. He had looked at her with disdain and said that she wanted to control them. Everyone present was shocked, because they did not believe that Madame would say such a thing. They had previously heard that she was bragging about her new purchases. They could not believe that she would do such a thing. The Empress, in turn, noticed that everyone was trying to shift the blame onto each other. She was puzzled and did not know how long this comedy would last. The madam said that she was not going to die alone, since all those present were also guilty, and no one refused expensive gifts. The Emperor looked at her with a grin and asked if she was ready to name her accomplices. He smiled and said that he would like to propose to her, as she said he was a tyrant. He wondered why he would bring them alive. The Empress looked at her husband in surprise. He looked at the culprits with fury and said that he even gathered their friends, but they continued to pretend. He looked at those present and said that because of their friends, they were the only ones dying. He said that they had to be fair, because everyone deserved to be punished. He said that he knew many of their comrades, but he might have missed a couple of names. He looked at them intently and said that they must now name them. The Emperor looked at the guilty with a grin and said that he would reduce the sentence for each name. Murin looked closely at the Empress and asked if she was okay. Elier looked at her assistant in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Murin said that perhaps she had no right to interfere, but as the Emperor had said, those who dared to steal from the treasury, given the seriousness of the crime, could be executed. She knew it was the right thing to do, but she felt bad about the situation. The man said that of course he attended these events, but it never occurred to him that they were organizing them with stolen money. Madame was furious and said that he was lying since he knew everything, since he proposed to replace the current Empress. The Emperor said he found it funny to hear this, as he thought he had dealt with most of the rats. The Emperor looked at those present and said that after returning from the war, he had gotten rid of several noble families. He asked if this was not a fitting warning to the others. He looked at those present intently and said that he would make a decision, but now they all needed to leave. The lady looked at the Empress and said that his life depended on her decree, and he could even die. She looked closely at the Empress and timidly said that she was sure she would make a wise decision. She told the Empress that she must remember that she must not sympathize with him. The Empress looked closely at the secretary and said that he was very calm for someone who was about to be punished. He sighed heavily and said that he had already been transferred to a worse job, and there were no opportunities left in the palace anyway. Although his unpleasant situation could hardly upset her, she looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really so disgusted by working with the Empress and not with the Emperor. He looked at the young lady and said that the Empire accepts people regardless of their status, but commoners still do not receive a proper education. He sighed heavily and said that it was difficult for him even to read to learn, and he had to fight for a long time for his position. He asked if she knew what reward he received for his efforts. Everyone said that they were very sorry that he was not an aristocrat. He sighed heavily and said that, of course, it did not bother him, because he could serve as an assistant to the emperor and decide state affairs. She looked at him intently and said that she also received some state assignments. The Empress said that she learned that he was previously responsible for them, but he was made her assistant. She said that she knew perfectly well that these matters were very important and did not want to deprive him of the right to deal with them. However, she looked through the documents and came to the conclusion that she was more suitable for this work. And if his knowledge in the field of construction was deeper, she would have informed the emperor. He looked at her hard and said that she had received the best education because of her noble birth. She looked at him hard and said that his personal misfortunes had nothing to do with his work. The Empress asked him if he really thought that his mind was comparable to her if he was born into a rich family. She said that the system of governance of the empire and all its laws were created by a sage, and sages are those who are recognized as masters in 3 or more disciplines, and it is necessary to put forward and substantiate several new theories. She said she presented her third theory and received the title at 20. She said that she was the third young scientist to receive a place in the Hall of Fame. Although no one knew about it, Jonathan thought that she was smarter than the emperor. She looked at the secretary intently and said that she was making every effort to work on time, but he was deliberately interfering and committing serious crimes. She said that perhaps in the future he could get a more important job. She said that he had no need to be angry with others because of his mistakes. He sighed heavily and asked for execution for himself, and perhaps in the next life he would be an aristocrat. She looked at her secretary and said that there would be no execution. She said that he must leave the capital and must see how they would move forward without him. She looked at him intently and said that he would see what she had done and then regret the missed opportunity. The young lady looked at him intently and said that his title and treasures would be taken away and he himself would be banished from the capital. He was forbidden to appear in the capital for the rest of his life. She looked at him closely and said that he didn't need to run away right away, since they let him pack his things. He sighed heavily and said that she seemed very pleased. She smiled and said she couldn't deny it. She said she just found it amusing that a person could screw up his life that much. Jonathan looked at the young lady with a smile on his face as he noticed that she was angry. She looked at him intently and said that he had told the Empress that status was not important, but that was just plain pity. She said that since they decided to spare him, he should take a closer look at the world. He will see many different types of injustice. He said he wouldn't have time to examine her because he wasn't an aristocrat like her. She said he was now comparing her to those ladies he had spoken so cruelly of. She knew that for those who insulted the imperial family, there was only the death penalty. She knew that she should have taken his life, but she could not. She understood perfectly well that one day she would still have to take someone's life. The maid looked at the Empress in surprise and asked if they were finished yet, since they had seen many aristocrats recently. The young lady froze in place as she realized that she had returned to her palace. She looked at her maid in surprise and asked why she was not resting. Katie S. said that the maid wanted to prepare her for bed. The young lady slowly approached the maid and said that there was no need for that, and that she should take care of herself. The maid smiled and asked how she could fall asleep, knowing that the Empress was still working. She smiled and said she didn't think she could sleep until he helped her with the preparations. The young lady thought for a moment. She remembered the words of her mother, Madame, telling her that the palace would become her home. She sighed heavily and said that she would certainly do everything to become a worthy empress. The emperor looked at the knight in surprise and asked if his wife had really said that she wanted to expel him from the capital. The knight sighed heavily and said that usually people did not like to take the lives of others, and besides, punishing the empress made sense. The emperor sighed heavily and said that it was unlikely that anything serious would happen in the future. He told the knight to forget about the man, as the empress might be interested in his condition. Jonathan said that he had to watch him until he ran away, and he even watched the empress when she returned to her place. He said that he was not against such work, but still he said that it seemed to him that the emperor liked Baltimore. He sighed heavily and said that they were equal in his eyes. Jonathan said that his friend was getting all the interesting assignments. The emperor looked at him and told him to stop grumbling because he wouldn't be sleeping today either. The emperor looked closely at the bunks and the czar and said that they had not taken out all the garbage. Jonathan said he would take care of everything properly. He smiled and said that the empress tried very hard for the sake of her servants, and they could not do otherwise. Reading the newspaper, the man was indignant as he knew that the aristocrats were already rich, but still they dared to steal their taxes. His friend said that the emperor executed them anyway, and they got what they deserved. The woman looked at her friend and said that her niece worked in the palace, and she said that the empress was the first to notice something was wrong. As he passed people, he heard everyone he knew how everything really was. He wondered if she would be just as arrogant the next time they met.